Too Much Information is a production of iHeart Radio.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Too Much Information, the show that brings you the secret histories and little-known fascinating facts and figures behind your favorite TV shows, movies, music, and more. We are your two fava beans of frivolity.
There it is.
Couldn't wait. Right out the gate. I'm Alex Heigl.
Your lovers of lotion, that would have worked too.
Ew!
Yeah. Oh, never mind. No.
Your skin suits of scintillating something.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh, and we're here to enthrall you with our acumen.
As you may have guessed, today we're talking about one of the all-time Oscar-winningest films, a movie with one of the most talked about to least actually on-screen performances ever, a little picture that taught us all to live, laugh, love, and believe in the well-scrubbed, hustling little Rube deep within. That's right, we're talking about 1991's The Silence of the Lambs. A perfect film, first of all. A literally perfect film. No notes. Great job, everyone. I was trying to think of when I picked this up, and I was remembering that I graduated right from Goosebumps to airport paperbacks, because that was like James Patterson,
Clive Cussler.
Yeah, I didn't do as much Clive Cussler. Mine was I read Jurassic Park because that came out, and then I just started going through the paperback racks and just doing I did a lot of James Patterson, who, it must be said, writes at a 5th grade level. So there was nothing that was out of my depth.
Clive Cussler had Raised the Titanic, so that was my entry point. Yes,
I did read one of his. I also did Robin Cook. I did all of his, which are very thuddingly boring. He was I think he was an epidemiologist or a medical doctor. He wrote Outbreak.
Oh, yeah.
James Patterson has the whole Alex Cross series where every serial killer has a different gimmick and a different name, and Robin Cook's one was diseases. So they had E. coli and Ebola and all this stuff. I read a bunch of those. And then at some point I found my boy T. Harris, my boy Tom's. I think my parents had him down in the basement, and I read
him literally in the basement in a well, lowering down lotion for him.
Yeah, so I read Silent. I think I read Red Dragon first, actually. I think I might have read them in order. Yeah, because then the big event of 99 was Hannibal coming out. It was the biggest, most talked about paperback sequel of the decade, in all honesty. And then at some point I found my dad, as was his wont, had rented this and taped it. So I found the handwritten Silence of the Lambs VHS dub in our movie cabinet, and I watched it one night while my parents weren't home and I was babysitting, and that was the worst decision I've ever made in my young life. At the time. I'm now old. But yeah, so it stuck with me, shall we say. And then I've reread them 5 or 6 times. I think that's the thing, is that Tom Harris is a great writer. Those books are good in a way that he is head and shoulders above your James Patterson. He is head and shoulders above Michael Crichton. Those books are just well written. And then of course, then there's every other movie except for the one we're going to talk about today, which are not good.
Yes, his books didn't really lend themselves to that many great movies. My entry point to Silence of the Lambs was exactly the same. I was 11, 12 years old, and I think I saw Hannibal at an airport bookstore and bought the paperback. I don't even think I made the connection that this was the same guy in Silence of the Lambs. But
Hannibal is a slog, though. That book is 1,200 pages long.
Right, but it's also the one where he feeds a bad guy to pigs.
Well, the bad guy was trying to feed him to the pigs.
Oh, right. Well, somebody gets eaten by pigs. That was my main takeaway from that.
Several people.
Oh, yeah, right. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned this on several occasions on this podcast. I'm not a big horror guy, yet I love Silence of the Lambs, probably because it's not really horror at all, right? It really kind of follows in the continuum of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in terms of being more of a suspense thriller.
It's a gothic thriller.
Ooh, I like that. And there's Hitchcock's famous maxim of, you show a bomb under the seats of the main characters, but you don't ever tell the characters about it. That's how you build suspense. And you see this in Hitchcock's movies time and time again. And you see it in Silence of the Lambs all over the place, especially when Clarice is facing off with Buffalo Bill at the end of the movie. when she arrives at Buffalo Bill's house and she's alone and she doesn't know that there's no backup outside, you, the viewer, know, and it's terrifying. Or, of course, I mean, the scene that still gives me chills is the night vision scene when she's in his darkened basement and you're seeing her through the point of view of Buffalo Bill's night goggles, and he reaches out and like swipes her hair, and you know that like he's inches from her, can reach out and grab her at any time, but she has no idea. Oh God, it's like, it's horrifying. It's the most perfect execution. See what I did there? Of the Hitchcock like bomb under the seat technique. It's so good. It's so perfect. But while Silence of the Lambs builds on these lessons from the masters, it also subverts the old tropes, particularly as far as gender is concerned. Jodie Foster described the plot of Silence of the Lambs like a fairy tale, like the hero goes off into the dark forest of evil and ignorance in order to rescue the princess and come out the other side with greater wisdom. That's, it's a story that we've seen for centuries. And yet, with Silence of the Lambs, the plot becomes a feminist metaphor in a lot of ways. As Jonathan Demme, the director, says, it's about one woman trying to save another woman and having to confront the dreaded patriarchy, and the worst of the male gender is going to be put in Clarice's way. So many facets to this. It's such a well-made movie, but it's also so smart too as a text.
Yeah, and just even we'll talk about this a little bit later, but just like the way that it visually represents all these themes. It was funny. Yeah. She majored in English lit at Yale. Jodie Foster did. So she talks in one of these interviews. She was like, "Yeah, I was coming at this from like Greek myths and like thinking of
it makes so much sense.
Idea of like like the woman, like the girl who leaves instead of a boy leaving in the hero journey, embarking on the hero's journey, it's a girl. She's great. I mean, yeah. What do you say? There's like nothing critical. There's no like critical summation about this movie other than it's amazing and perfect. And then we'll get to the flaw of the big flaw later. From the real-life origins of Hannibal Lecter, Buffalo Bill, and Clarice Starling, to the magnificent production details that make the film such a masterpiece, to the sadly botched rollout of the movie from a dying studio and its triumphant award season run, here's everything you didn't know about Silence of the Lambs. I just want to keep saying, oh, I love it, over and over again. I have nothing else to add to this. In 2019, this is amazing. Thomas Harris, first of all, mad props for never giving interviews, never talking about anything, writing like 5 books, and that's it. He gave his first major interview in 2019.
Ever? Like that was his first?
No, I think it was like literally his second.
And the other one was like in the 70s or something?
Yeah.
Wow.
And then he had given one on like public access TV that's on YouTube. It's really funny. He repeatedly insisted to the New York Times reporter, I've never made anything up, when she would ask him about a character or a plot, which is somewhat alarming, considering that his biggest contributions to pop culture and literature are the world's most famous fictional cannibal, an Ed Gein analog contributing to the trans panic of the 1990s, and the villain from Red Dragon, who is on that same spectrum of weird. He hallucinates that a famous William Blank painting is commanding him to kill people with his grandmother's false teeth.
And then there's the pig guy, too.
Yeah, can't forget about Mason Verger, the pig guy. The hog guy. Red Dragon is actually the introduction to Lecter, and the entire plot is basically a dry run of Silence, just with a different FBI agent. It's kind of funny in retrospect. The FBI agent in Red Dragon is a guy named Will Graham, and he basically visits Lecter and tries to get hints about the current guy that they are trying to capture, the titular Red Dragon, although the nickname they use for him is the Tooth Fairy, which irritates him to no end. Anyway, Harris grew up in Mississippi, and he was working as a journalist in the 60s for a pulp magazine called Argosy. And he was sent on assignment to Mexico, to Monterrey, to the Nuevo Leon State Prison. And he explained all this in Introduction to the 25th anniversary of Silence of the Lambs. He was sent there to interview a man named Dykes Askew Simmons, who was there under a death sentence for killing 3 people. And this guy, Simmons, had attempted to escape the previous year. He had bribed a guard, but the guard betrayed him and shot him. Harris then had a disturbing conversation with the prison surgeon who saved Simmons, who Harris calls Dr. Salazar, in which this guy just has very Hannibal Lecter-like conversations about the nature of suffering and, like, is talking to Harris about Simmons, was like, do you think he was bullied as a child? Because he had a cleft lip, which is interesting because that's the character in Red Dragon, the villain in Red Dragon has a cleft lip. And then when Harris went to leave the prison, he I guess remarked to the warden, "That's a weird prison doctor you got there." And the warden was like, "That man is not. He is a patient. He is a murderer. He is not our doctor. He is." He said, "As a surgeon, he packaged his victim in a surprisingly small box. He will never leave this place. He is insane." The warden was half right. Dr. Salivar was really a man named Alfredo Bali Trevino, and as a medical intern in 1959, he got into an argument with his lover, Jesus Castillo Rangel, slit his throat, chopped him into pieces, and buried him in a parking lot. Trevino was the last person sentenced to death in Mexico in 1961, and a Mexican reporter named Diego Osorno helped Thomas Harris look up what happened to this guy. Found out he got out in 20 years. So... great.
Crime of passion? Like what?
Yeah.
Okay.
But then he stayed in Monterey and he spent the rest of his life like treating the poor and the elderly in a low-cost medical clinic. He refused to discuss his crimes. He was contacted by a different reporter in 2008 and he said, "I paid what I had to pay. Now I am just waiting for divine punishment."
Which came in 2009.
Yes, which came the following year. He died. So anyway, 1981, Red Dragon, Harris's second novel. His first is Black Sunday, which is a terrorist potboiler. I actually haven't read that one. Writing in the Washington Post, Stephen King called Red Dragon probably the best popular novel to be published in America since The Godfather.
Wow.
High praise. The film was adopted into a movie called Manhunter in 1986, starring CSI's William Peterson, directed by Michael Mann. It's okay. It's not great.
Yeah.
Tom Noonan stars as the Tooth Fairy, and Brian Cox is Lecter. And no, not many people liked it. It kind of flopped. But Harris told a friend of his named Anthony Brandt in his only televised interview in 2021, he said, "After Red Dragon, I wanted to try to do a woman investigator. During this research trip I made to Quantico into Washington, at the time there was a plague of starlings in Washington. They were all around the White House. They were soiling everything, and there were just great flocks of them. They were playing different sounds around the White House to try and scare them off. The FBI building, looks like a concrete cage, and they were in every opening in front of the building. So I don't know if that's where the name came from, but they were certainly everywhere."
What is Quantico? How would you...
That's a training facility.
For FBI agents.
It's like their big compound. I think it's actually in Virginia. It's, but it's where they have like the fake towns and all the shooting ranges and they build like a fake downtown for vehicular stuff, and they have all these like training facilities. It's huge. It's very sprawling. Clarice, meanwhile, Harris said that came from a woman in the soaps at the time who had a sort of Appalachian accent. And I Googled this and I went researching this because of course I did. And as far as I can tell, he is either talking about the actress Clarice Blackburn, who is most famous for Dark Shadows, or the character Clarice Hobson from Another World.
Which one of those have an Appalachian accent?
One of them is from the South, and the other one, the character, is from the South. So I don't know. Maybe in 50 years, well, he'll be dead. But maybe in 10 years, we'll find out which one Thomas Harris was talking about. Published in 1988, The Silence of the Lambs was a huge hit. People who blurbed it ranged from Roald Dahl, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory author Roald Dahl.
Noted misanthrope Roald Dahl.
He did hate everyone. Who described it as subtle, horrific, and splendid. The best book I have read in a long time. To friggin' David Foster Wallace.
Wow.
Who used... he put this on his curriculum when he was teaching at Pomona College, and he put Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon on his list of 10 favorite novels. So 2 Thomas Harris entries on the on David Foster Wallace's top 10 favorite books of all time. Nothing to sneeze at. So Red Dragon was bought by Warner Brothers, and then Dino De Laurentiis, one of the villains of this story,
Giada's grandpa, right?
Possibly?
Yeah, I think so.
That.
Giada De Laurentiis' grandpa, I believe.
Well, he made a hot TV chef daughter. And he made Conan, so I can't fully hate him, but yeah, he really ran...
Granddaughter.
He really ran poor Hannibal into the ground. Dino De Laurentiis picked that up, and they made Manhunter, and Manhunter was not a financial success. Hollywood manager and literary agent Bob Bookman told Deadline in 2017, When Silence was published, Thomas had the right to sell a one-picture license, but he would have had to change character names and places. Nobody was interested, even though it was way up on the bestseller list. It was a combination of the serial killer aspect and the failure of Manhunter. Then one day, my colleague Fred Spector asks, "Are those rights still available?" Gene Hackman wants to buy them. Gene called a good friend, Arthur Kermit Orion, and they bought it together, 50-50 partners. Gene wanted to direct and play Hannibal Lecter.
Screenwriter Ted Talley, as luck would have it, knew Thomas Harris because he was a client of his wife's art gallery. That's how you break into screenwriting, my friends. And he was sent an advance copy of Silence of the Lambs. And he later told the Washington Post, "As soon as I read it, I knew it was a career maker." And he got his agent on the case to adapt the book. And one fan of this book was Gene Hackman. Gene Hackman hates most things, loved Silence of the Lambs novel. He told Empire magazine in 1991, "It's one of the most cinematic books I've ever read. As I read it, the movie was clicking in my mind." But Ted Talley, the guy who ultimately wrote the screenplay for Silence of the Lambs, told Deadline that while Gene Hackman was sure he wanted to direct, he was still trying to figure out if he wanted to play Hannibal Lecter himself, which would have been wild. But he was also saying that maybe he would play Clarice's FBI superior, Jack Crawford, and get an unnamed and unspecified Bobby to play Hannibal Lecter. Ted Talley continued to Deadline, "I didn't have the nerve to ask Bobby who. Bobby Duvall, who was indeed up for the running at one point, Bobby Redford, Bobby De Niro. He just assumed I would know who Bobby was." And then when Gene Hackman quit the project while I was writing my first draft, he never called me. I just heard one day from my agent that Gene Hackman dropped out of the project. And Gene Hackman dropped out for reasons that are kind of vague, but one theory is that he dropped out days after losing an Academy Award for Mississippi Burning. And so he was really unsure about doing another film that so deeply plumbed the depths of human darkness. But there's another oft-repeated reason that he may have dropped out. Producer Bob Bookman recalled the Deadline, "I got a call saying, 'You're not going to believe this. Gene Hackman's daughter read the book, and she called her father and said, "Daddy, you're not making this movie."' So ultimately, the studio gave Gene back the money that he put up for it. I think he put up like $250,000, if I recall. Yeah.
Gene must be whipped by his daughter. Imagine being one of the A-list stars and your daughter calls you up and is like, "No, you're not making this movie."
I mean, it is a movie where he would have to eat somebody's face.
He doesn't eat any faces in the movie. He just bites that guy and then sprays pepper spray into it.
I'm sure Hannibal Lecter has eaten a face. Maybe not that face, but
he probably swallowed a little bit of it, but
it just gets in there.
Or it's like stuck in your teeth, you know? And you got to spend the whole night like working a piece of it loose. Like, oh, what is that? Is that popcorn? And you're like, oh, is that a security guard? Is that a Memphis cop? Oh, they could do them with a dry rub. A nice Memphis dry rub. Here's a pitch. Here's a pitch. We reboot Silence of the Lambs. Instead
with
of
Guy Fieri. So that's how Orion got the rights. They bought out Gene Hackman, poor old Gene Hackman, who made, what did he make instead? Probably something bad.
Oh, great question. Great question, Jordan. Let's check out his IMDb. Well, this would have been 90, 80, 89. Let's see what his...
Yeah, what was his run between 89 and 92?
Well, the next movie he did was called The Package, and then something called Loose Cannons, and then Postcards from the Edge. A string of flops, to answer your question. A string of flops, and then his next one was Unforgiven when he was, and then he did The Firm. But yeah, man.
So Gene Hackman's loss was Orion Pictures' gain and Jonathan Demme's gain. Jonathan Demme later told Deadline, "God bless Gene Hackman's daughter if that's true," and that's what I've always heard about Gene dropping out. And to Empire magazine, Jonathan Demme added, "I wouldn't have offered it to me as director." And this is fair. Jonathan Demme was working with Orion Pictures after 1986's Something Wild, which is a comedy, and 1988's Married to the Mob, another kind of very broad comedy, if I recall. And then he pitched them a script that he wanted to make. I don't actually know what script that was, which Orion Pictures tentatively agreed to, but only if he agreed to read Silence of the Lambs first and consider directing that, which is how he wound up doing it.
One hurdle to getting to the film was the villain of this story, Dino De Laurentiis. He had produced Manhunter, and he still owned the rights to Lecter, which we'll come back to later, why I keep calling him a villain. They toyed with changing the character's name. They didn't find anything that worked. And so Bob Bookman, this literary agent manager, went to De Laurentiis, hat in hand, to ask for permission to use them sans charge. And Dino, he didn't like that.
I can't believe he signed off on that.
I think they did not think it was gonna, because the last thing that they had was Manhunter, and they were like,
well, yeah, but still, that's easy money.
They gave it to him for free and regretted it ever since, and have embarked on the past 30 years of money grubbing horse to get revenge for it. Anyway, Jonathan Demme initially wanted Michelle Pfeiffer, which is hilarious. He'd worked with her on Married to the Mob, but Pfeiffer, for the same reason Gene Hackman, she turned it down. She told New Yorker in 2021, with Silence of the Lambs, and here she invents a word, I was trepidatious. There was such evil in that film. The thing I most regret is missing the opportunity to do another film with Jonathan. It was that evil won in the end, that at the end of the film, evil ruled out. I was uncomfortable with that ending. I didn't want to put that out into the world.
Does evil win in Silence of the Lambs?
I think she meant like Hannibal was free.
It gets
but
away.
Yeah, that's still
kind
bad
of
reading. Bad reading of the movie though.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like on the surface, I think that would have been a terrible choice for Clarice Starling, but she was also in. Well, no, she was also in. She was in Dangerous Minds.
Oh yeah, that movie's not this though.
No,
nor does she turn in a Jodie Foster caliber performance on this.
Okay, no, all right, that's fine. I also heard they were considering Gina Davis, which is kind of weird, and Meg Ryan, which is extremely weird. This must have been when she was making her jump to semi-serious roles. Like this was probably around. She probably, instead of making this, made When a Man Loves a Woman when she played the recovering alcoholic with Andy Garcia. The movie's devastating, real bummer.
I would have accepted Gina Davis. She's tall enough.
Yeah.
Anyway, screenwriter Ted Talley told Deadline, Jodie Foster was always in my mind. It was no-brainer. It was a no-brainer. She had just won an Academy Award for The Accused. She was the right age for the character. She had the right intelligence to play somebody like that. I thought she was just a fabulous, fabulous actress, and she actually even called me while I was writing the first draft. We had never met, and she called me to campaign for the part. That was before Jonathan was on board. Jonathan initially wanted Michelle Pfeiffer. I said, she's too beautiful. I think she was also like 10 years too old. Like they were looking for someone who could convincingly be a trainee, like out of college, and Michelle Pfeiffer was in her 30s. But Foster had been lobbying for the rights for the film even before Jonathan Demme had gotten involved. She told Variety Fair in 2021, Hackman dropped out after I had made it known I wanted to be involved in this film. And Orion immediately sent it to Jonathan Demme. I was furious. I was like, oh no, not Jonathan Demme. He won't want me. He'll want someone else. And so I flew to New York and said, I'd like to be your second choice. I'd won the Oscar for The Accused and everything. It wasn't like I was a nobody, but it was really something that I ran after. Empire Magazine did a making of around the time in this movie, and that's where one of the places I'm quoting from. They quoted her as telling Demme at their very first meeting, there are reasons I want to make this movie. There are very personal reasons, not just because it's a good part. So a lot of people have surmised that it is because it all ties back to what we like to call the John Hinckley quandary. No?
The John Hinckley experience. My favorite cover band.
Yeah, that guy. Yes, John Hinckley Jr.'s pre-music career as a wannabe presidential assassin. I didn't know this until I was researching this. Jodie Foster had another stalker like a few years later. Okay, so I guess quick historical summation. Do most people know this? Is this a thing people remember? Has to be.
Tell them
it's
anyway.
Like a huge... okay, yeah. John Hinckley Jr. Was a deranged man who developed a crush on Jodie Foster after seeing her in Taxi Driver.
Where she was 14?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that kind of gets... I guess after like trying to kill the whole president thing, that it gets outshone.
Yeah, it's gross. And the way that he got it in his head to impress her was by killing Ronald Reagan, and he attempted to do so. And now he's touring the mid-level venues of the music venues of the country playing Beatles covers. So, who said
Is it Beatles covers?
Oh yeah, he sings covers.
Well, I didn't know it was Beatles covers. Oh God.
Let's see if he's got a set list out there. Oh no, it was Joni Mitchell. That was the one. Both sides now. He said he was influenced by the Beatles and, of course, Bob Dylan, but the cover he posted was Joni Mitchell. Yeah, so I'm so happy this guy has more of a music career than I do. Anyway, so Jodie Foster had another stalker when she was at Yale. A guy named Michael Richardson targeted her while she was enrolled there, taking a break from acting, majoring in English literature. And so she essentially wanted to do a movie where that she would have a woman playing the protector role, and she had, the other thing too is she had gotten close to a lot of these FBI agents. She's told Empire, the thing that I really love about Clarice Starling is that this may be one of the first times I've seen a female hero that is not a female steroid version of Arnold Schwarzenegger. This is not a woman running around in her underwear with a machine gun. Clarice is very competent, and she is very human. She combats the villain with her emotionality, intuition, her frailty, and vulnerability. I don't think there's ever been a female hero like that. As I mentioned, she grew close to several FBI agents who were, assigned to her after the Hinckley thing. Some of them even went to a play that she did at Yale, which I find adorable. But because of that, she had one big caveat for Jonathan Demme. She told him that unlike Married to the Mob, you can't portray these FBI people as goofy Republicans. If you want me to be your hero, you've got to portray them in the correct way. And one of the things that Demme did to really highlight how at odds Starling is in the world of the FBI and the world at large and law enforcement is that they deliberately cast people to be in all the men in scenes with her to be like extra tall. Worked with the casting agent Howard Frewer to find men who would just like conspicuously be much taller than her, which isn't difficult. She's only 5'3", but she's, whenever she gets into the FBI elevator, everyone there is like 18 inches towering over her. Then the other one that I picked up recently was there's like that scene where she is literally a punching bag as part of their training. They could have filmed any number of other like FBI training scenarios, and they do a quick insert where she's called out of a class where she is holding a punching bag and getting kicked and punched by male agents. So very on the nose, but effective.
Jonathan Demme later said the moment he knew he wanted Jodie Foster for the part was when she paid him a visit to lobby for the role of Clarice Starling. And he said that he knew quite literally when she walked in the door. He's quoted as saying, "I watched her coming down the hall towards me, this sturdy little figure striding along with this determined look on her face. And I just thought, that's her, that's Clarice." Also, there's a slightly less charitable version of the story where Orion Pictures, the production company making this movie, wasn't sold on Anthony Hopkins in the role as Lecter, which we'll get to in a minute, and Jonathan Demme wasn't sold on Jodie Foster for the part of Clarice. So the Orion chief said, "All right, listen, Jonathan, I'm going to make it real easy for you. If you take Jodie Foster, I'll take Anthony Hopkins." So it could have just been a political move on Jonathan Demme's part.
Hurtful.
Yeah, I know. I hope it's not that, though. Ironically, for all of her personal connections to the role of Clarice, Jodie Foster didn't think that this part was Oscar bait. Screenwriter Ted Talley recalls her telling him, "This isn't the kind of part that people win Academy Awards for, just because it's not very showy." Wrong. One of the few times Jodie Foster was wrong. Funnily enough, for all of his doubts surrounding Jodie Foster in the lead role, Jodie Foster herself was a little wary of Jonathan Demme's directorial credentials, mostly because of his background in comedy. And this was also compounded by the fact that Jonathan Demme was not a believer in rehearsals, so they only had one read-through by the time they got in front of the cameras, which must have been scary. Jodie Foster later said, "At first the ambiance on the set, which was very nice and playful, was off-putting for me because Jonathan makes a lot of comedies and likes Hawaiian shirt Fridays and likes kidding around and practical jokes. We were making this dark drama, and I was worried that everybody was going to bring this comedic sensibility to it." I love the idea that like they're in Buffalo Bill's basement and everyone's wearing Hawaiian shirts. Although I think it was done in January during like the coldest winter in Pittsburgh on record at like 14 degrees below zero. So maybe not Hawaiian shirts on that stage.
Jodie Foster's most direct model for Clarice was a woman named Special Agent Mary Ann Krause, who she met at Quantico while she was doing her research. And Krause told People magazine in 1991, "We went out to dinner and my first and lasting impression was that Foster was very sharp and eager to learn. Not just about the FBI, but about me. She really wanted to get a picture of a female agent. She asked me about my family. I'm married to a former agent and have 2 stepchildren. She wanted to know how tough the training was for women and if I felt like one of the guys. I told her yes, but that it was important to maintain some form of femininity to keep your identity." The film secured cooperation from the FBI after the Bureau read the script, and Foster practiced on the actual Quantico training course, which is how she's able to apparently effortlessly scale that rope wall. I would eat shit on one of those things.
Oh, yeah.
To tell you that right now.
Not. Yeah, this whole thing is so interesting to me. Apparently, this was one of the first movie productions allowed at the FBI training facility because the FBI saw this as a potential recruitment tool, not unlike the Air Force with Top Gun. And they were really having a hard time recruiting female members, so they really thought that this was their great opportunity. The production staff of Silence of the Lambs described their relationship with the FBI as, quote, cooperative and guarded. And yeah, Jodie Foster apparently asked the special agent she was shadowing, Marianne Krause, if there was ever a moment during the day for any sort of emotional release when you're in the midst of this really hardcore training. And Krause replied, only when you're by yourself. Tears are not really allowed. Hence the scene in Silence of the Lambs where Clarice breaks down alone in her car, which I believe is the only time she ever breaks in the entire movie, aside from when she's with Lecter.
Yeah. Foster and Anthony Hopkins' chemistry was helped by Demi's claustrophobic way of shooting the actors and their scenes together. He said, by the time I got to Silence of the Lambs, I was madly in love with close-ups because I'm madly in love with actors. And a basic premise of Silence of the Lambs is the story about two people fighting their way into each other's heads. So the close-ups and the subjective camera stuff, that was something cinematographer Tak Fujimoto and I were excited about. Jonathan wanted to use this technique that Hitchcock talked about, where you have the actors use the camera as the other person, Jodie Foster told Vanity Fair. And I think there was something really interesting about that for the film, but that also meant that Tony and I couldn't see each other. For a lot of the close-ups, we were looking into a camera lens, and the other person was just a voice in the background. They filmed Lecter and Starling's first interaction down in the dungeon on Hopkins' first day of filming. Wow. And because it was plexiglass, because the way that this film was constructed, they actually had to lock him in there. So he was in there for an entire day of shooting at a clip. It is really interesting to me about the plexiglass and stuff, because when they move him to Memphis, which is not actually Memphis in the movie, you know, he's actually in the cage, to make the sight lines of the bars work for them, they zoom even closer in. It's a tighter close-up. And it's really interesting the way that it works in the film, because like, early on when he's still in Baltimore, you know, you see their full bodies, you see them standing, and they're kind of in conversation distance. And then by the time they get to that point in the film, at their most intimate moment, when she's talking about, you know, what gives the film its name, when she's talking about her recollections of growing up on a ranch, they are so close into each other's faces and it looks like they might as well be like face to face. And it's just such an incredible way of having the look and shots of the film mirror the story and the thematic progression. Gosh, it's neat.
Yeah, the production designer said they were really happy with the plexiglass because it's even more terrifying than bars because there's nothing visually between them, and they love the fact that it made Hannibal look like a specimen, like he was a shark in a tank or something.
They were also really annoyed when the sound guy I read was annoyed when she proposed that, because the guy was like, well, okay, now you're going to have the whole film sound like this. And so they did the thing with drilling. They were like, okay, we'll drill air holes in it. And I guess Mike right above that. And then she was like, and Anthony just immediately did this like sniffing thing with the air holes. And we were like, that's a pro at work. This production designer, Christy Zay, she's really interesting. She told the Museum of Moving Image in an interview that they did a lot of scouting out west to try and find this ranch that Clarice talks about running away from, because initially they were going to film scenes there and then insert them as cutaways, right? Like as she's telling the story of trying to rescue this lamb and getting caught, they were going to cut to, you know, a young actress doing the young, like they do in other scenes. But then after he filmed Foster and Hopkins doing that, he was like, no, we're not doing that. Scrap it. There's no reason to cut away from this.
Yeah, he told the screenwriter, if I cut away from those performances, I'll be drummed out of the Directors Guild. I cannot cut away from those faces for a flashback. He literally said Jodie Foster could win an Academy Award for this acting scene. Hilariously, in the middle of that scene where, you know, it's the pivotal moment of the movie, it gives the movie its title, where she's just describing this early trauma. It's just like mind melding of the highest order with Hannibal Lecter. In the middle of that scene, a grip in the background dropped a wrench, and the whole crew just like flinched. But Jodie Foster was so in it, she didn't lose focus and kept on going with her speech. And then when Jonathan Demme said cut, she whirled around. I was like, what the hell was that?
That's amazing.
But that's the take that was used in the movie. And I watched it a couple times, and I can't hear like the clatter in the background. I don't know if they looped the audio or what, but
that's so funny. Man, I'm obsessed with seeing if I can find some imperceptible like twitch of her eye or something in that scene.
I tried, yeah. You know
what
who
was I
probably
gonna say?
could? Hannibal Lecter.
That's true. Oh, don't ruin the Blink thing yet. We got to get to the Blink thing.
You're right. Sorry.
Despite their chemistry, or more likely because of it, Jodie Foster explained on the Graham Norton show that Anthony and I got to the end of the movie and had never really had a conversation. I avoided him as much as I could. On the last day of filming, they finally spoke. He came up to me and I said, I don't know, I sort of had a tear in my eye. I was like, I was really scared of you. And he said, I was scared of you.
Oh yeah, we'll talk more about that, but it's crazy. This was really Anthony Hopkins' first like big budget Hollywood movie.
Yeah. After he cleaned up. Wasn't he like in the running for like number 3 drunkest thespian after like
I was like 75, I think he got clean.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I remember that from that Hellraiser's book where he was like,
right.
He talked about like quitting cocaine after a really bad night. Anyway,
you don't quit cocaine after a really good night.
I want to see young Anthony Hopkins. Was he like?
Oh yeah, he was in The Lion in Winter, which rules. That movie's incredible. With Katharine Hepburn, which is one of the people that he based the voice for Hannibal Lecter on.
Yeah, he's kind of always looked like a murderer. I can't really even imagine him looking like. I was like, was he cute? It's like, no, he just already like at 25, he looked like a psychopath.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Demi told Deadline that there was tremendous interest in the role of Hannibal Lecter, with actors ranging from Dustin Hoffman, to Morgan Freeman.
Sure.
But he said Sean Connery,
yes,
was the only actor the only other person I thought could be amazing for this. Connery has that fierce intelligence and also that serious physicality. So to take the most commercial path, because Connery was flying very high at the time, we sent the script to Sean Connery first. Word came back shortly that he thought it was disgusting and wouldn't dream of playing that part. Show, Clarice. Have the lamb stop screaming? Terrible. That would have been awful.
Was he smart? And I love
What
Sean
was
Connery.
he smart? I don't think so, no. He certainly not smart enough to not keep talking about how okay it is to hit women in the press repeatedly. Certainly not smart enough to not take League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
He was smart enough not to do Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull.
That's true. I'm going to find more Hannibal lines I can do as Sean Connery.
What did Miggs say to you? Multiple Miggs.
Discourtesy is unspeakably ugly to me. I would never have had that happen to you. What's his
I myself cannot.
Yeah. What's his line when he's he's talking to the senator?
Love you, Sue. Oh yeah. One more thing.
Oh, we could do this all day. I'm sorry. I'm sure you have things to do.
I've also seen, we talked earlier about how apparently Robert Duvall was up for consideration for the part of Hannibal Lecter. They were apparently worried he would push it too far, despite the fact that they were also considering Dustin Hoffman, Morgan Freeman, Sean Connery, and also Jack Nicholson.
Oh, that would have been terrible.
Who never responded to the request. So, but like Bobby Duvall was the one that they were worried about.
Yeah, he would have been too broad.
How would Jack as Hannibal Lecter have sounded?
So Clarice. Well, I don't think I can pull it off. I don't think it's. No, I'm not gonna do it. Give me a second. Maybe it'll come to me.
I need a line. I need a line to say.
I'm really hung up on this Sean Connery thing. We begin to covet by what we see every day. No, that is incidental, Clarice. He would have he sounded like a nagging asshole. That's the thing. No, Clarice. That is incidental. Read Marcus Aurelius.
It's a little bit Napoleon Dynamite, kind of. You just throw like a god in there. God.
I gotta find more to do as Connery. It's gonna be my new parlor game. You know who would have been great who you threw in here was Jeremy Irons.
Oh yeah, he turned it down because he just played Klaus von Bülow and he didn't want to get typecast as a baddie. But then he went and made Lolita. The Lolita
and he had
remake.
been in Dead Ringers, so I think he probably didn't want to hit another gory horror thing on the you know.
You know what you could no.
You kind of had it.
Like, you know what you look like with your good bag and your cheap shoes? You look like a rube.
You got to do it as him as Whitey Bulger though. From
yeah, That's hard.
A census taker tried to test me.
Can you do Morgan Freeman? That's
No.
tougher? Yeah.
No. Sorry, am I supposed to be reading?
I'm still trying to come up with. All right, yeah, we're here, by the way, but I'm still trying to.
Jonathan Demme had Hopkins in mind as well, motivated by his role as the Doctor in The Elephant Man. Sure. He said, I was in the theater in London. My agent, Anthony Hopkins, told Vanity Fair, I was in the theater in London. My agent phoned me, and he said, I'm sending a script over to the theater called The Silence of the Lambs. I said, is it a children's story? I didn't know. No, he said, it's with Jodie Foster. I said, oh. So I came into the dressing room and I started reading it, and I got through about 10 pages. When Crawford said, the FBI agent, you don't want Hannibal Lecter inside your head, I thought, ooh, that's it. I phoned my agent and I said, is this an offer? He said, well, it's not a big part. I said, I don't care.
Aww. Apparently he wasn't sure if it was an offer or just like something to consider, so he stopped reading after about 10 pages because he didn't want to. He just was trying to spare himself the disappointment if he didn't get the role, which makes me sad.
Yeah. I wonder if he read did he ever talk about reading the book?
I don't think so.
Anyway, Jonathan Demme told Deadline Anthony was doing M. Butterfly in London. I flew over and we agreed to do the work together. And Hopkins and Foster didn't even meet each other until the first table read. She told Vanity Fair, I didn't really get a proper meet with Tony. So we're sitting across from each other, and he launches in, and we start the reading, and I was just petrified. I was kind of too scared to talk to him after that.
Well, we touched on this earlier. Anthony Hopkins was a little nervous himself because it's really difficult to remember. When he was cast in Silence of the Lambs, he was ready to give up on Hollywood for good. Late 80s movies like The Bounty and The Good Father and A Chorus of Disapproval were all bombs, and he'd gone back to theater work in London, just assuming that his film career was over. So now here he was, working on his first big-budget Hollywood movie with a newly minted Oscar winner, and so he later admitted that he had a pretty big case of the nerves this whole time.
We had a read-through in the boardroom at Orion a week before we started shooting, Jonathan Demme told Deadline. All the executives were there. There was electricity in that room, coming off of what Hopkins was doing. He had found Lecter, and I remember when he delivered the last line, the room was just silent.
Well, can you do the last line as Sean Connery?
I'm having an old friend over for supper.
That's good. Wow. Lovely changing dinner to supper so you can get the in there.
Yeah, of course.
That's a wow. Good. Nicely done. There's a great story from this early read-through where Jodie Foster starts to cry as she tells the story of the slaughtering of the spring lambs. Again, it's the scene that we spoke about earlier. And Anthony Hopkins, in character, took out a handkerchief from his pocket and slid it across the table just as the scene continued. And those present said it was just such a powerful moment between the two because it really offered a taste of their funny chemistry that borders on, it's like paternal, but also kind of romantic, but also kind of, it's weird. So their relationship is fascinating.
Someone said she has 3 fathers in this movie. She has her actual dad who like haunts the entire story and drives her to be a lawman and save old girl. What is her name?
I don't know. I never can remember her name. Caroline, maybe?
No, I don't
Debbie?
think that's it. Just keep going. I'll tell you when you're close. Is it Catherine? I thought the senator's name. The senator's name is Catherine, though.
Oh.
No, it is Catherine. It is Catherine. What were we talking about? Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I was reading. I forget if this was someone. I forget if it was Demme or someone, but they said, Clarice has 3 fathers in this film. She has her dad, who she talks about being inspired to go into law enforcement because of, and his death obviously haunts her, still haunts so he lingers over the entire movie. She has Jack Crawford, who's her career dad, and they also have kind of a weird thing because Scott Glenn is such a hottie. And then she has Lecter, who is sort of pushing her to become the best version of herself that she can, and giving her kind of the reinforcement that she lacked growing up, saying like, I mean, yeah, what is a dad if not someone to say things like, the world is more interesting with you in it, Wait, I want to do you know what you look like to me with your good bag and your cheap shoes? You look like a rube. A well-scrubbed, hustling rube with a little taste. Good nutrition's giving you some length of bone, but you're not more than one generation from poor white trash, are you, Agent Starling?
It's somehow more sinister as Sean Connery.
I'm leaning into it.
All the way to the FBI.
All those tedious, sticky fumblings in the backseat of cars.
God. All those. I can't. To do it as Jack Nicholson is too gross even for me. Yeah.
Hopkins told Empire there were 2, maybe 3 voices that I heard for Lecter. I thought of him as a combination of Katharine Hepburn, Truman Capote, and Hal from 2001.
That's so perfect. That's
it is.
Exactly
it really
what
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I didn't realize, this is maybe a geographical distinction that gets lost, but Hannibal Lecter's from Baltimore or lived in Baltimore. I think he's originally from Lithuania, if I'm remembering his fictional character biography. But he does a little bit of a southern accent at different points, like the love you suit and like some of the different things. Like he's almost leading,
mocking them though.
Well, that's exactly it. You're like can't tell if he's doing it as an insult.
Well, there was a moment when he does the bit about like just one generation away from poor white trash, and he
was your daddy a miner? Did he stink of the lamp?
Apparently, Jodie Foster got like genuinely annoyed because she was like, "This guy's mocking me."
Yeah,
on our first day on the set,
and he was.
Yes.
He said, in terms of Lecter's physical appearance, it was Jonathan's idea that he be pale, and he convinced me to stay out of the sun. It was my idea to give him dark, slicked-back hair. I also wanted him to wear a very tight prison uniform that would suggest total control. Costume designer Colleen Atwood told The Hollywood Reporter, with Anthony Hopkins, the fit of the costumes was very precise. We had a lot of fittings. Even though it was a prison uniform, we felt that Hannibal would somehow make it look like his clothes were made to order for him, even though he was in prison.
Anthony Hopkins said he was very big on brightly colored white outfits, like the one that he wears in the man cage when he eats the cop's face, because he said it reminded him of the doctor who took out his tonsils as a boy, which was an experience that left him traumatized.
Yeah,
it's so funny hearing Hannibal Lecter talk about the things that scare him.
Including one of his drama teachers.
Oh, yeah.
When I was in the Royal Academy, there was a teacher we had, a Stanislavski method teacher, and he was lethal, Hopkins told Vanity Fair. He was very charismatic, and he was deadly. He would rip you apart. He would just take you apart intellectually. He'd just smirk, and he'd say, "No, do it again." His name is Christopher Feddes. He's retired now. You'd do a piece, and he'd say, "Do it again." No. I based it on him. No, Clarice. This teacher had stayed in my conscience all my life. I got a phone call afterwards. "Tony, it's a wonderful performance. Did you base that on me by any chance?"
He's still alive, apparently.
No, that is incidental.
That is
no, that is incidental. Do you think Jack Crawford wants you sexually? It's too much fun. You should have left that detail out at the expense of total accuracy so that I wouldn't be derailing this for the next 3 hours. I'm going to run out of line readings before we run out of time taping.
There's only like 24 minutes of Hannibal Lecter in here. Hey everyone, this is Jordan a few days after we taped this episode. Now, I couldn't stop thinking about what it would sound like if Jack Nicholson had been cast as Hannibal Lecter. That was one of the few impressions that Heigl couldn't conjure up. So I started fooling around with some voice cloning software, and I came up with what I think is a pretty decent facsimile. Now, I didn't tell Heigl anything about this, so I'm just sneaking it in right here as a little surprise for him. Hope you enjoy.
You know what you look like to me with your good bag and your cheap shoes? You look like a rube, a well-scrubbed, hustling rube with a little taste. Good nutrition has given you some length of bone, but you're not more than one generation from poor white trash, are you, Agent Starling? And that accent you've tried so desperately to shed? Pure West Virginia. What's your father, dear? Is he a coal miner? Does he stink of the lamp? You know how quickly the boys found you. All those tedious, sticky fumblings in the back seats of cars. While you could only dream of getting out, getting anywhere. Getting all the way to the FBI.
Thank you very much. And now back to our regularly scheduled program.
As you meditate on that, we'll be right back with more Too Much Information after these messages.
Anthony Hopkins would recall that Jonathan Demme told him that Hannibal Lecter was, quote, a good man locked inside an insane mind, which is who among us, really? And the fact that he played the good doctor in The Elephant Man went a long way in getting him the role in Silence of the Lambs, because this role led Jonathan Demme to wonder, what if the good doctor went terribly wrong somehow? Which is Hannibal Lecter. And screenwriter Ted Talley described Lecter as, quote, the Sherlock Holmes of evil, which I love.
Yeah, they really push that a little too much in my mind in Hannibal, when he's like basically doing like secret agent shit. He's like taking out a whole gang of cops and whatever. My decision was to play the non-psychopathic side of him, to play him very quiet, very charming, not dripping blood, Hopkins told the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. I played King Lear once, and the trick of the mad scenes is not to play them, not to play him mad. The lines that Shakespeare wrote for him are mad enough that you don't have to act madness. Just play it normally, but the audience is listening to this madness coming out of the lines. What Hannibal does, what he says, speaks of madness, speaks of cruelty. What he does to those two guards is cruel and violent, terrifying and insane. But you don't have to act that out. That makes him more frightening. It's the old maxim of less is more. Of that iconic introductory scene when they go down, they do that long, slow walk down the cell block. Hopkins recalled to Vanity Fair, I remember the day when Jonathan asked me how I wanted to be revealed for the first time. It was Monday, January the 9th, 1990. I think he kept a diary because he's very precise with these dates in this. It's very creepy. He said, the camera's going to be Jodie coming down the corridor. How do you want to be seen? Do you want to be standing or reading or asleep or something? I said, no, I'd like to be standing. Where? I said, in the center of the cell. Why? I said, I can smell her. Jonathan said, you are crazy. The inhale sucking thing, the thing is, he says, in the commentary track for the DVD, he did it as a joke. He didn't think Demme was going to keep it in. Demme was like, that was wacky. We're keeping that. But it's actually really funny. In the DVD commentary, he says that he was inspired by Bela Lugosi as Dracula, but he freely admits that he doesn't actually know if that's something that Bela Lugosi does as Dracula, or if it's just something that he thought he did.
He assumed he I understand that.
Yeah.
That's knowing something emotionally and not intellectually. I like that.
Yes. Knows it in here, taps to heart.
Yeah. It's truly one of the best character introductions in movie history, because after all this build-up, the most terrifying thing that Hannibal Lecter could do was just stand there amiably. And you're like looking for you're waiting for him. It's the suspense thing. You're waiting for him to snap. You're waiting for him to become the guy that you've heard so much about for the first 20, 25 minutes of the movie. I love that they'd shot for like a month, I think, before Anthony Hopkins came to the set. So this kind of, I think, added to this whole sense of anticipation.
Sure. Yeah. Hannibal's iconic mask took some developing. The production designer called it an interesting dilemma. She said for a while there were thoughts of fencing, sort of grid masks. That was a costume designer, Colleen Atwood. And you can see the non-cool looking one is when Chilton's in his cell telling him about the new offer from Senator Martin. When he gets the pen from Chilton, he's got that sort of half like fencing mask thing that really actually very awkwardly like squishes Anthony Hopkins' nose down. So for the hockey-inspired mask that they ultimately used, Atwood said in a 2014 interview, we sent it to a guy to be made from a drawing. All I wanted was a hockey-style mask. The designer sent it back to me in raw fiberglass to check before it was to be painted and glazed. It looked like it was made out of this piece of skin or leather. Straight away, I said, it's so much better doing it this way than doing anything else to it. So that's how the mask came to be. And that's back in the day when multiples were not regularly made or marketed. So I think only 2 of those masks exist in the world. Now, we come to one of our most favorite bits here at TMI, which is ruining things. No, it's debunking oft-aggregated pieces of trivia. If you go to lesser clickbait factories across the internet, not the union-made, made in USA
in America
by hand clickbait that we do here, you find this persistent thing that he doesn't blink. Anthony Hopkins does not blink while playing Hannibal Lecter, which even a cursory rewatch of the movie would disprove. But ground zero for this appears to be our girl Barbara Walters. Friend of the pod, Barbara Walters. She volunteers unprompted in this interview. I think he's talking about like being still or something. And she just goes, "You never blink."
I assume she's speaking metaphorically.
No, because she says, I've seen this clip. She says, "You never blink." And he immediately goes, "No." And then she says, "As Hannibal." And he says, "No." And then Ted Talley, the screenwriter, this is as recently as 2021. He was talking to Rolling Stone. He was saying, "I don't know if you would notice this even, but he only blinks one time in the entire movie. And he does it very slowly and dramatically. Otherwise, his eyes are completely wide open. He trained himself to do that." Not true. Neither of those things are true. Sorry. He doesn't blink a lot, but he certainly does not blink never, nor does he blink only once. So, myth busted. Where's my
Air horn?
Where's my soundboard? Give me a second. What do you got? All right, myth busted.
We're living Moths once again.
Can you imagine Hannibal if he had been in worse or less dignified, dire straits like finances after this movie came out? Can you imagine him as Hannibal Lecter doing Taco Bell commercials? Can you imagine Sean Connery as Hannibal Lecter doing Taco Bell commercials? We begin to covet by what we see every day, and that includes the new Quesadilla Supreme, available for a limited time at Taco Bell. Pairs well with a nice Chianti. All that said,
one of the upsides of having no ad sponsors on the show.
All that said, Anthony Hopkins was super creepy on the set.
Oh, good.
Demi recalled in a making of an on-set interview, every morning when we do a Lecter scene, Tony would come in and say, "Good morning, Jonathan. You know, you're really the one that's mad." He told Empire he just showed up with Dr. Lecter. As a matter of fact, I've spoken to him a few times recently, and he's still Dr. Lecter. I'm a little distressed about that, but that's Tony. I like to think that Tony just got the joke about Dr. Lecter in a way that nobody, save perhaps Thomas Harris, may have gotten. And the film's editor, Craig Mackey, recalled a very wonderful image of Hopkins sitting in the all-white outfit, covered in fake blood, on set, reading Eudora Welty. Not a shooting day went by without Tony gliding up behind Jodie or myself, baring his fangs and going, "Good morning," Demi told People in 1991. Or he'd look round with these gigantic eyes at the whole crew and go, "You know, Jonathan's the mad one. He never blinks. He's quite insane."
The obsession with blinking on this set is great.
It weakens him. Anyway, it worked. Aside from the Oscar and untold millions in box office gross and the thousands of impressions, parodies, and Halloween costumes dedicated to Hannibal, the character was named the greatest villain in American cinema by the AFI, the American Film Institute, in 2003. He holds the record for winner. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. The character and Hopkins hold the record for the shortest amount of screen time that went into a Best Actor win. And I didn't time this out. I'm not that much of a nerd. I'm not going to watch this movie with a stopwatch. But I have seen estimates of as low as 16 and as high as nearly 25 minutes of screen time. Seems like a big variance. I don't know why we can't nail that down. But if you or a loved one want to, send us your stopwatch readouts, we'll Venmo you $5.
Let's see, who are the best supporting actors up for that year? So this was 1992. Best supporting actor, the winner was Jack Palance for City Slickers, Tommy Lee Jones in JFK, Harvey Keitel in Bugsy, Ben Kingsley for Bugsy, and Michael Lerner in Barton Fink. Anthony Hopkins could have taken on them.
Yeah, you sure could have.
Because he was going up against Warren Beatty, Robert De Niro, Nick Nolte, and Robin Williams in Best Actor. So it actually seems like less competition in the supporting actor. Jack Palance? Come on. Well, of course, the film wouldn't be complete without its big bad, Ted Levine's horrifying killer, James Gumb, a.k.a. Buffalo Bill.
Not pronounced Jamie.
I
want to be pedantic about it because it says it in the text. I only know this because I've read this book like a half dozen times. It's like it was an error on the character's birth certificate, and he insisted on it pronouncing it James. As like James without the S. It's just a very funny note that they made it into the movie, but some people say Jamie in the movie.
But he's more commonly known as Buffalo Bill because, as the Kansas City Homicide apparently joked, this one likes to skin his humps. Ooh.
Awful.
Ooh. Johnny Douglas, the now retired FBI special agent who's probably the most famous profiler in history. He's written the book Mindhunter inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit. That's the inspiration for the famous Netflix series. He's personally interviewed some of history's most notorious serial killers, and he was also a consultant on Thomas Harris's books and the film Silence of the Lambs. And with John Douglas's help, Thomas Harris modeled Gum as an amalgam of real-life killers like Ted Bundy, who used a cast on his hand to lure women into his car to help him, like Gum did. Gary Heidnick, who I wasn't familiar with him, imprisoned, tortured, and killed women in his Philadelphia basement. I said that way too chipperly.
Go Eagles.
You say go Eagles?
Yeah, dude, Philly. Philly represent. Philly doesn't care how it's in the news, just that it is.
Gary Heidnick, a bad John, if you will. And then, of course, Ed Gein from Wisconsin, who killed at least 2 women, probably more, but also dug up graves and made trophies out of bones and skins from corpses. Is he the one who made lampshades out of... okay, charming. Yep. Johnny Douglas, the FBI profiler, is also the inspiration for the Jack Crawford character in the Lecterverse. He's been played by Dennis Farina, Harvey Keitel, Scott Glenn, and Lawrence Fishburne in various Hannibal Lecter properties. But he's not a fan of these movies, though. He's told the New York Post in 2017, they don't put across accurate portrayals, these movies, and that aggravates me. I can't look at those movies.
Well, that's a bummer.
Yeah, I know. I feel like when FBI profilers get aggravated, people die. I feel like he's high on the list of people you want to keep happy. Ted Levine, the actor who played Buffalo Bill, I'm just going to keep calling him Buffalo Bill because that's who he is to me, told Rolling Stone in 2021 why he wanted the role. He said, I read the script and the script was great. I read the book and the book was better. I reread the script and realized it was also pretty damn good. I met Jonathan Demme and everything fell into place. Ted Levine auditioned for the role of Jamie Gumb, Buffalo Bill, after John Malkovich, who is his peer in Chicago's famed Steppenwolf Theater Company, passed on the role. Wow, John Malkovich would have
He would have been good. Yeah,
that would have been really good.
It puts the lotion in the basket. He would have been so precise and annoying.
Yes. The enunciation, the diction would have been off the charts. Ted Levine said, I scared them to death in the audition. This is him talking to the Chicago Reader in 1991. I had no idea what I was going to do. Actually, I think my audition was better than my performance by far. And after he got the role, he went in depth into research. He said, I read a lot of shit. He's talking to Hunter Adams, his director in 2014's Dig Two Graves, for an interview. I went to Quantico. I met the guys there in the behavioral science unit and talked to them. They showed me some shit, and I heard some shit, actually. They got cut off because they were showing me shit they shouldn't show me. I saw some shit there, and it wasn't good. Heard some tapes of people that did horrible, horrible things for real. And aside from the killers that Thomas Harris based Buffalo Bill on, Levine added Jerry Brudos, who's a foot fetishist serial killer from Oregon, into his performance. And he said that the basis of his character was based on the assumption that these serial killers were, quote, self-indulgent, addicted to the idea of sex and death being close together. And they really got off on that. Just an interesting insight.
I have a theory that John Douglas had one tape that he showed all of these guys because Scott Glenn talks about going to visit him as well and being like traumatized by the tape that John Douglas played him. So I have to wonder if John Douglas just like pulls it out of his desk and like blows the dust off it and is like, here's the tape I used to traumatize people who want to come here and research behavioral profiling and serial killers. Do you want to know what tape it was? I actually know that. It was a tape of these. I think he talks about this in the Inside the Labyrinth documentary. There were a pair of serial killers who were kidnapping teen girls in chronological order. So they like started. I forget if they started with like 11-year-olds or something, but they went out and specifically found one at every age, and they were keeping them chained up and torturing them, and that was the tapes. They made tapes of them like torturing them and screaming, and that was the ones that he showed or played for Scott Glenn and made him reconsider his position on the death penalty. That's how bad it was. Which, yeah, that'd do it. Yeah. And then I think it was John Douglas. The actress who plays Catherine Martin Brooke Smith was, I think in her Vulture interview, she talks about like during one of her like breakdown scenes, she like came up for air, so to speak, and on the set, and John Douglas was there, and he was like, "Yep, that's what it's like," which is either great to hear as an actress or just bone chilling. Ted Levine also visited a drag club where he found some insight into the character. He told Rolling Stone, "I talked to a lovely, probably 5'1" Hispanic boy girl and bought him a drink." Obviously, this phrasing is outmoded. "I asked, 'Why do you do this?' He said, 'When I'm a dude on the street, I'm just a little Puerto Rican motherfucker. When I'm here, I'm a hot Latina mama.' It struck me that it was about power. By trying to become a woman, he gains power, hence the moth, the larva turning into the butterfly, the whole thing blossoming. It was the same impetus as a female impersonator, but it became psychotic. It was donning the cloak of feminine power. And perhaps most horrifyingly, he added that for Bill's voice, I kind of did my mom a little bit."
Phrasing. Just as creepy are the bodies that he used to make his skin suit. No other word for it. For the skin suit, they used a life model and then disassembled it and then sewed it back together to make it more segmented. And for the body fat of these bodies, they used pastina pasta and KY jelly, which as an Italian upsets me deeply.
Yeah, they didn't use any fake corpses for this because one of the special effects guys was like, "Oh man, all those models you made sounded great," and all the crime scene photos, even the woman in the autopsy, those are real women. Those are just made up and like had to stay still.
Do you talk about what the larva thing was made out of in here? You must, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Sorry,
Tootsie Rolls and gummy bears, right?
Yeah.
Brooke Smith, who plays the kidnapped senator's daughter, told Vulture, "I already had the part, and it was like, 'Hey, Brooke, can you come in and read for the 3 people for callbacks for the people we're bringing in for the role?' I guess they wanted to see what we looked like together. And oh my God, Ted was just it. He walked in the door, and he wasn't an actor trying to get a job. The guy who had gone before him and had props, had everything figured out, what he wanted to do, and they were like, 'Thanks for coming in.' I can't really say what Ted did in that room, except I thought, oh my God, I'll never be able to audition again. Because if people are this good in the room, I'll never be able to get any work. I remember asking him later on set, 'What did you do? You were unbelievable.' He was like, 'It's so funny you say that, because I didn't know what I was going to do. So I just drank a lot of coffee.'" Brooke Smith gained 25 pounds for the role. She told Rolling Stone, "I was in an acting class with Vincent D'Onofrio when I got the role, and he had just done Full Metal Jacket. So he said, 'You got to ask the producers to give you a credit card. They got to pay for your food.' So I did. And we always joke that's why they went over budget, because of my food." That's the film when Stanley Kubrick kept calling Vincent D'Onofrio to his house, and Vincent was like,
"Not fat enough."
Yeah, he was like, "Oh, I'm gonna get acting advice about the character." And like, I think for the character, and Kubrick would just be like, "No, still not fat enough."
Just slam the door in his face.
Yeah,
just on the stoop. He don't even let him in.
Just opens the door. "No." "Thanks for coming."
Brooke Smith, who played the senator's kidnapped daughter, she's pretty hilarious in real life and in these interviews. She's got a million of these similar lines. In a 20th anniversary feature for the History Channel, she recounts a moment when Jonathan Demme asks her if she's ever been in jail, presumably to get her in the mood for being locked in the pit. And she replies, "Jonathan, I've never been in jail." And Jonathan Demme was like, "Really?" And she got all offended. And then she makes a point of turning to the documentary camera and going, "And I still haven't been in jail, Jonathan."
Yeah, she's really funny. I like her a lot.
She's so funny, yeah. And she also talks about Buffalo Bill's famous
the
naked
tuck dance.
Yes, that he does. Apparently they made that up on the set. And she said that in the same documentary, people come up to me all the time and say, "My boyfriend always tucks his penis in and does that dance," which is a really weird thing to say to me. It's like, oh, okay, great. He sounds like a great guy.
Ted Levine and Brooke Smith actually grew quite close on the set, to the point where Jodie Foster started calling Brooke Smith Patty Hearst in reference to the heiress turned bank robber via Stockholm Syndrome. "We had to take care of each other to shoot those scenes," Smith told Vulture. "We had to trust each other."
Anthony Hopkins thought it was really funny to see the pair having lunch together after spending the whole day being tortured by him.
I think she gave him one of the necklaces that he wears in the penis tuck dance scene.
Oh,
Which is so cute and horrifying. Smith talked about, despite the fact that Tom Petty's American Girl has been indelibly linked with her character in the film, another track being floated was Shaka Khan's I'm Every Woman. And that as a veteran of New York City's 80s punk scene herself, she wanted Bad Brains to go with the movie, which is hilarious.
Cool.
Can you imagine? Smith told Vulture that she locked herself in her parents' basement closet as research, which got her in the right headspace. I had a lot of bad dreams before we shot, but by the time we got there, I was pretty relaxed. I think all that screaming is kind of a primal therapy. So I'd be really relaxed at lunchtime, and all of the Teamsters and everyone would be not relaxed after having lived through the past few hours of me screaming. Ted Levine and Jodie Foster, meanwhile, deliberately avoided each other. He told Rolling Stone, "We stayed away from each other, and I think that was a good choice when you're the antagonist and you're dealing with a protagonist." That night vision scene, though, took 22 hours to film. That's nuts.
And that was on her last day, right?
Yeah, last day of filming.
Wow, God.
Foster's, anyway.
Yeah, but at least it wasn't actually in complete darkness for 22 hours.
Which I am ashamed to admit that for the longest time, I was like, wow, they actually shot that. Because her performance is so convincing.
And in an interview, she laughs about it. She can't figure out why everyone thinks that it's real. And it's like, well, because you're really good at it.
Yeah, you're an amazing actress.
But she points out that if this were actually really done in the dark, it would be completely shadowless with this night vision thing. But there's a telltale shadow when Buffalo Bill lifts his hand with the gun. You see a shadow on her shoulder. So,
yeah, in the book, I remember there's a thing about he's immediately struck by her hair, and so he has this whole thing about wanting to use her hair as part of his suit. They filmed those basement scenes in what was once a giant airplane turbine factory in Pittsburgh, and it was on a multi-level set. So Smith could either enter it through a trapdoor at the bottom, which they cover with dirt, or through the sides. And then it was actually the filmmakers and everyone shooting it were actually 20 feet up. And it was, I forget who talks about having to look down into that thing and it giving them vertigo.
Yeah, she said it was a real bummer when she was in the pit and had to go pee. That was annoying.
Yeah. Well, she had a bucket.
Yeah, all in all, being on this soundstage that they built in an abandoned GE turbine factory seems like hell. They were filming during the coldest Pittsburgh winter in recent memory in what was described as, quote, a giant cement block with no heat in it, 14 degrees below zero, so cold that the elevators regularly froze, and the crew had to wear chemical hand heaters. So Brooke Smith was a real trooper being down in that pit. The real friends were the penises we tucked along the way.
She, of course, also spent a lot of time with Darla, the dog that plays Precious. She said, "I felt bad for that dog," told Rolling Stone. "I just thought, well, how does this dog know that this isn't real? The trainer was always there. If I was looking up at Ted, the trainer would be right next to them, and the trainer was almost scarier because I was like, I better not hurt this dog." Oh, and the lotion placed in the basket under threat of getting the hose again. Brooke Smith says it was just crappy lotion, nothing fancy. And the prop mistress, Ann Miller, delivered the bottle to her apartment in New York a few years after shooting, which is really creepy. She said, "My doorman was like, someone left you this package, and it was the lotion, just this little white plastic bottle. She taped a piece of paper to it that said, 'It puts the lotion on the skin. It does this whenever it's told. J. Gum.' I don't think I've seen her since then." That's horrifying. That is a strange thing to do.
Oh, I mean, as somebody who collects random memorabilia like I do and is really sentimental, I appreciate that.
But just to anonymously drop it off and then you never see that person again, that's what's creepy.
The fact that they know where you live is a little, that's kind of disconcerting.
Another iconic aspect of the performance, the dance to cue Lazarus's Goodbye Horses. That is a prosthetic nipple, which Ted Levine and Jonathan Demme both said freaks people out, but it is not a real nipple, guys. The crotch tuck dance is in Harris's book, and Levine said, it's something any boy can do at home. I thought it was essential. He told the Chicago Reader to prepare for the filming that scene. He took a couple of shots of tequila.
Yeah, he's kind of echoed that quote in a lot of interviews I've read with him. It's a simple thing that anybody can do in the privacy of their own home. It made it immediately accessible to people. Sure.
I'm not going to disagree with that, dude. I I was as shocked as everybody else when I saw him tucking his genitals between his legs and posing, screenwriter Ted Talley told the mag. I thought, oh my God. When Jodie first saw it, she said, this is really disturbing, which is the idea.
So was it in the book, but not the screenplay, but then they made it up on the set? Is that...
I feel like they might have just been like, James does a creepy dance in the mirror. Like, I don't think they... I think he looks great, by the way. He looks great with that long hair and makeup. The scalp, I mean.
Oh, was that? I think I missed that.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of a blink and you miss it moment. It's when he's like adjusting it. You can see it has like a bloody piece of like scalp on it still. Yeah.
Oh.
But that scene almost had a very different flavor, pun intended, when Levine started working on it. When Levine started working on it with Jonathan Demme, it was soundtrack to Bob Seger's Her Strut. He explained, I actually had a different, very sort of raunchy stripper dance rehearsed. When Goodbye Horses came up, it served my purposes better. It made it a little gentler and stranger. It wasn't just so crass and sexual. It was a little bit more feminine, and I liked that. Do you know about Q Lazarus? Do you know her life story?
I don't know.
She was born Diane Lucky in New Jersey, and she had a band called Q Lazarus and the Resurrection. She was working as a cab driver in New York in the 80s, and when she picked up Jonathan Demme as a fare, she played him her demo, and they remained unsigned, but he put Candle Goes Away, one of their songs, in Something Wild, and hit 1986, and then Goodbye Horses, which is the only single she ever released commercially. He put that in both Married to the Mob and Silence of the Lambs. And then he cast her in Philadelphia singing a Talking Heads song, which is one of the songs that they actually do in Stop Making Sense, which is a really nice full circle moment. But she never really managed to make anything out of a music career because she basically fell off the map until like 2018 or 2017, where she was tracked down by some freelance journalists. They found her in Staten Island, where she'd been driving a bus for years. So Goodbye Horses indeed. Levine sadly wound up typecast after the performance. People recognize my voice a lot.
Yeah,
it's a horrifying voice. But I'm grateful I could get equal attention for his other biggest role, Stottlemyre on Monk. That's a show a kid could watch with her grandma. He was locked into these creep roles for a while until Jennifer Jason Leigh actually pitched that he play her husband. He play a stay-at-home dad in the 1995 movie Georgia, for which he said, I will be forever grateful to her, because it helped break out of his typecasting. And he doesn't do a lot of interviews about this. He really doesn't talk about it. He said he's never watched the movie. So there you
he's
have
gotta
it.
Be so sick of it. I mean, do we think it ruined his life? If he was like poised to be like a John Malkovich level, like
Chicago Steppenwolf character actor, and then the people were just like, it's the do the tuck thing. They're like, it's Buffalo Bill. Hey, it puts the lotion. Hey, hey Ted. Hey, it puts the lotion in the basket. Remember when you remember?
That was awesome.
It was. I was the thing when you did the penis. That was awesome, man. Can I get your autograph? Yeah, I would go. No, I would go insane.
Yeah.
Scott
and the rest.
Scott Glenn, hottie with a body. He's so handsome. I love him so much.
Isn't he like a Chuck Norris level, like martial artist? And then he's like 80 something.
Yeah, he's done a lot of martial arts. He was photographed like doing like knife routines in Men's Health at one point. He was just coming off of Hunt for Red October in 1990. But Jonathan Demme had actually known him from years prior. They'd both worked on a Roger Corman biker picture called Angels Hard as They Come. Phrasing. Nope, I'm not even going to say it. Demme co-wrote and produced that film, and he gave Scott Glenn one of his first big on-screen parts. Roger Corman has a cameo in Silence of the Lambs as the head of the FBI. And so does George Romero, zombie auteur, pride of Pittsburgh. George Romero pops up as one of the prison guards escorting Clarice out of the cell in Memphis.
And another beloved Pittsburgh performer, Don Brockett, famous for playing Chef Brockett from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, plays one of Hannibal Lecter's cellmates. Though sadly not Miggs, because that would have been amazing. You also missed my favorite cameo, I think, of this entire movie. Chris friggin' Isaac.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Of that song I don't like.
No.
Wicked Games. Yeah. He plays one of the cops. I think it's one of the cops in the scene where
he's on the
Hannibal eats
SWAT
the
team.
guy's face.
Yeah, he's a SWAT guy. He's the SWAT guy.
Yeah. No, he's not a SWAT guy. I think he's a cop. Oh, is he a SWAT guy?
Chris Isaac?
Oh, okay.
I think he is because they do like a conspicuous. They do like a conspicuous like he gets out of the truck and it like zooms in on his big Chris Isaac jaw and he says like "let's go" or something. I was like, okay, Jonathan.
Were they trying to position him as like a Harry Connick Jr. style? Like, no, he can like crossover artist, or
I don't know. I don't care. I don't think anything's interesting about Chris Isaac.
Well, here's something that's interesting about Chris Isaac. He'd worked with Jonathan Demme. He's had a couple run-ins with Jonathan Demme. He worked with him in Married to the Mob. And Chris Isaac also worked with Jonathan Demme in my beloved That Thing You Do, where Demme had a cameo as the director of the beach party movie that the Wonders are appearing in, Weekend at Party Pier with Captain Geach and the Shrimp Shack Shooters. And this is perfect because Jonathan Demme had just directed Tom Hanks in Philadelphia, and Tom Hanks did a little role reversal. He's directing his old director now because Tom Hanks wrote and directed That Thing You Do. Plus, Jonathan Demme had got to start working with Roger Corman, as you mentioned, who's the king of the 60s teen movies. So it's kind of cute. He's putting him in this role as a director of a teen movie in That Thing You Do. I love that.
Scott Glenn and Jodie Foster's dynamic in the film is one of its strongest parts, and it was something that Demme was shepherding along from day one. Scott Glenn told Rolling Stone, "After I read Ted Talley's script, I remember thinking, this is the strangest relationship of the movie, even stranger than her and Lecter. I don't know about that, buddy."
Yeah.
I remember Jodie and I were doing a table reading early on, trying it one way or another, and Jonathan Demme said, "Don't play the relationship. That's just a writer being a writer." Later on, there's a scene where she's leaving Washington, and I'm helping walk her out to the car. She had a hard time getting in, so I just took her arm to sort of help her getting into the car. And Jonathan yelled, "No, cut." He comes running, like really running up to us and goes, "Scott, I do not want you to touch her." Jodie said, "Well, he's just helping me in." And then he says, "Remember back when we did that reading and I told you two that you couldn't play that relationship? Well, it exists on the screen. I see it in every frame of the footage I watch the two of you. And I just know that instinctively that if you touch in this scene, it's going to blow it all. You should only touch her once at the end when you shake her hand. That handshake will be so loaded, and it only works if you don't do that." It's a good point. Frankie Faison plays the orderly Barney, had just starred as the landlord in 1988's Coming to America when he was up for Silence. And he had actually appeared as a detective in Manhunter, the original Red Dragon adaptation. Jonathan Demme had a thing about not wanting to hire any of the crew who did Manhunter, but like a few people somehow sneaked in. So Frankie Faison got himself cast in Silence, and then he reprised that same role of Barney the Orderly in Hannibal and in the Red Dragon remake, which makes him the actor with the most appearances in the Lecter-verse.
Nice.
He said to the AV Club, "I think I was a crossword puzzle answer in the New York Times. What more can you ask for?" Anthony Hopkins plays the oily Dr. Chilton, the head of the psychiatric hospital who grossly overplays his hand against Lecter and winds up paying the price. Demme had seen quite a lot of Hield's drama work on stage in New York and contacted him. Hield wanted to play Chilt from the outset, but Demme didn't think he was old enough. A couple weeks after his audition and this talk, Hield told the AV Club, "I get news. We're going to do a reading. Jodie Foster has been hired as Clarice, and Gene Hackman has been hired as Hannibal." The day before the reading, I get a call from Jonathan. Gene Hackman has dropped out. His daughter doesn't think it's the right role for him. So we don't have a Hannibal, but we still want to do the reading. Jodie is flying in. This is not an audition. I would not cast you in this role, but it would help us out if you would, tomorrow at the reading, read the part of Hannibal Lecter. I said, sure. So for the first time we read the script, I was sitting across the table from Jodie, and I was playing Hannibal. I had a great time. After the reading, Jonathan took me aside and said, "You can play Chilton. You convinced me." When I told Jonathan in that first meeting that I wanted to be Chilton, he said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I always play lovable nerds. Chilton is much more complicated, less sympathetic, and I think it would be exciting for me to explore that. I think that my sort of boyish, pleasant demeanor would set up a nice contrast with what's coming out of that character's insides." But, much like Ted Levine, he wound up typecast as a weaselly dickhead for the next chunk of his career.
And you can't self-identify as a boyish.
Yeah, that dude's boyish in like 1950s years when people aged at 7 times the rate they do now. Though the film takes place in the D.C., Virginia area, the film was shot in and around Pittsburgh after extensive canvassing by Demme and producer Kenneth Utt, who has a cameo as the funeral mortuary. Yeah. The city's Natural History Museum is where Starling gets the bug found in the autopsy, and that model is constructed of a mixture of Tootsie Rolls and gummy bears because it was actually in that woman's throat, which is horrifying. So I don't know oh, no. The Soldiers and Sailors Museum in Pittsburgh is where Lecter makes his terrifying escape from. And that hit a little too close to home for good old Ted Levine. He told the Chicago Reader, "Once I got the part, I was looking at location scouting photographs. They said, this may be Gum's house. I'm thinking this house looks really familiar. They told me, we found this really awful, godforsaken coal mining town on the Ohio River. And I said, Bel Air, Ohio. And they said, yes. I grew up in Bel Air. And the house they were thinking to be Gum's house was next door to the house of my girlfriend when I was in the 3rd grade." The hospital, though, this is really interesting. Every shot you see of the hospital that she goes to visit Lecter in is a different location. So, like, the Anthony Heigl talked about, they would go and just do, like, a pickup of them, like, walking through the offices, and that was, like, a jail. And then they would go somewhere else, and that, like, that cool staircase shot that they're going, the concentric staircase thing, that's, like, a 3rd location. And then the dungeon, the cell block where Lecter is obviously a set, and production designer Christy Z said that she took influence from where the Nazis were on trial at Nuremberg, not the Memphis one. I forget what I didn't read actually what she said about the cell block in the freestanding cell in the one in the Memphis one.
I'm just stuck on the escape though. I mean, that is just that whole. I mean, visually it's so stunning. I mean, just this giant cage in the middle of the room. It just seems like
that's in the book. Yeah.
The least efficient way to keep a prisoner, but okay.
I think it might have been another visual callback to I mean, I didn't read anybody about this. I'm just spitballing, but when they put Andrei Chikatilo on trial, who was the like the most famous Russian serial killer, they put him in a jail.
It was later though, right?
No, cuz he was dead by 94. Oh no, you're right. He wasn't on trial until 92. Yeah, you're right. I stand corrected. I should know better.
One thing I know.
I was going to say
Soviet serial killers.
I was going to say I should know better than to not come correct.
So I love this escape so much, but apparently one person who does not is Hannibal Lecter himself, Anthony Hopkins. He said that was particularly unpleasant. I guess he's referring to eating the guy's face. I did not enjoy that. That was shot around 3 a.m. Here's an all-time quote. Eating someone's face off is kind of ridiculous.
It is.
Yeah, yes, it is. It's true. They did that whole face biting thing by having, I think, rubber like teeth guards in Anthony Hopkins' mouth, and then like a rubber mouth guard in the other guy's mouth with like a little bit that stuck out. So Anthony Hopkins is like biting with like rubber mouth guard, like a piece of rubber in this other guy's mouth. So that's how that effect was achieved, I guess. And then the oddly elegant nightstick beating, where he looks like he's almost conducting. That was done by hitting a rolled up sound blanket wrapped up with gaffer tape, and there was a grip down below throwing up fake blood onto Anthony Hopkins' face every time he would strike a blow or land a blow. And then that grotesque tableau that Lecter stages with the cop's body and the Christ pose on the cage, that was inspired by Francis Bacon painting.
Yeah, I did read that. They're in the Museum of Moving Image. I saw a couple of them. How did he get that guy up there?
Handcuffs.
How did he lift him up there? He carry him up a ladder?
Oh, I don't know.
How much time do we think that took, start to finish?
That's a great question.
Because you think he has to take the other guy. He has to take the other guy, change clothes, take that guy and throw him on top of an elevator.
Well, no, don't forget take his face.
Take his face.
Yeah, take his face.
Throw him on top of the elevator.
Bracket. I don't have access to is
the face taking.
Taking some. Yeah, take face taking.
Oh, I do. It's about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Facial fillet.
Come down to McDonald's for the new facial fillet. Well, I'll be having you for dinner. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment.
Ray Mendez, whose credits include bug-centric films like Creepshow and later Joe's Apartment, served as the moth wrangler and stylist for Silence of the Lambs. Everything he says regarding the moths was accurate in the movie. They even borrowed some of his cases to use in Gum's lair. The only thing that he had trouble was finding the death's head hawk moths, since there was only one colony at the time. It was in England, and they were recovering from a virus. So he got the idea to use another species of moth and dress it in a little costume, which is so adorable. He painted the little death's head, the little skull, onto a fake press-on fingernail, and then used like dissolvable glue to affix it to the moth in a way that wouldn't harm it. He told Rolling Stone, when Clarice is going down the corridor and there's moths flying, I've got all these moths that are ready to go in the box. I'm running in front of the camera, out of view, throwing moths like the Romans used to do with rose petals.
Incredible.
Movie magic. Because they were shooting in the cold part of the States during a record cold winter, the moths had to be kept in a separate heated environment. And I heard that the cast members were joking to this guy, hey, can you represent me next time? Because the moths had to be kept. They had their own heated compartment, and he would have to say, okay, moths got to take a break. And Jonathan Demme would be like, all right, break for moths. Meanwhile, Jodie Foster shooting in 22 straight hours in that horrific basement.
Yeah, this moth wrangler / stylist is wildly entertaining. He said that he would keep the larvae in a heated incubator when he noticed that they were starting to, I guess they were hatching. I don't know what the correct term is. And then he would put them in a refrigerator, which he emphasized didn't hurt the moths. He was very, very concerned about the moths' well-being, but slowed their activity down because they're cold-blooded. So then it was time for Buffalo Bill to shoot the scene with them. He'd take them out of the fridge and into the room, and the room temperature would lead them to like heat back up again, and they'd start to wiggle as soon as Ted Levine started handling them, which I think is pretty cool.
And gross.
And gross. Yeah, very gross. And there's this one documentary where you have got the guy playing Buffalo Bill. And he says, in his Buffalo Bill voice, there were no moths harmed in the making of Silence of the Lambs, which is hilarious.
Yeah, that man really does have a creepy voice for the ages.
Yes. While much of Buffalo Bill's lair was built on a soundstage, the house in Perryopolis, Pennsylvania, in which the upstairs and exteriors were filmed, was on the market for many, many years because no one wanted to live in Buffalo Bill's house until 2020 when an entrepreneur named Chris Rowan bought the decidedly dilapidated 4-bedroom Victorian for just $290,000, and he's since turned it into an Airbnb and attraction. And he even enlisted the help of the Pittsburgh special effects legend Tom Savini and the nearby Special Effects Academy to help recreate the well, the pit in the basement where Catherine was kept, which in reality was done on a separate soundstage. So yeah, you can stay in Buffalo Bill's house and sleep in the pit if you want, if that's your thing. But Buffalo Bill's house is not the only Silence of the Lambs location you can visit in the Pittsburgh area either. Every Halloween season, the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall, where Hannibal Lecter's bloody escape occurs, holds a Silence of the Lambs themed event, presumably in that very room. And a local horror attraction company, 100 Acres Manor, built a replica of the freestanding cage that Hannibal Lecter escapes from, and they erect it in the cavernous hall for photos and
such
grotesque cosplaying, I suppose.
No segue here. Howard Shore composed the score for Silence of the Lambs. It was recorded with the Munich Symphony Orchestra. I think it's a great score. I'm baffled by when I was researching it. I just did not find anything very interesting about it. They said it was kind of like they wanted something that wasn't going to be like the score for Psycho or like Jaws. Like they didn't want everyone to have like an instantly identifiable theme that was going to jump out of the way. I think they wanted it to be kind of unobtrusive and more, I guess, wallpapery. So good job. Aside from Goodbye Horses and American Girl, probably the most famous cue in the film is Glenn Gould playing Bach's Goldberg Variations, which Lecter conducts later following that escape. I found a long scholarly paper called Dr. Lecter's Taste for Goldberg, or The Horror of Bach in the Hannibal Franchise, from a 2012 issue of the Journal of the Royal Musical Association. But I won't bore you with that. Just funny, I think it's out there.
Dr. Lecter's Taste for Goldberg. I see what you did there. Nice.
The puns write themselves with this stuff, really. I mean, it's kind of you don't really have to do too much.
Well, kind of touching on what you said earlier, Howard Shore made a really interesting observation about his score. He said that it was more operatic than most movie scores, certainly most horror scores, because it was designed to underpin the emotion of the scenes, which I guess you could argue that all scores do that, but this one on a more subtle level. Jonathan Demme said that the music was something that was felt rather than heard. And I would agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I watched whole scenes from this a couple hours before we taped, and I can't remember a single one, but I remember they were very affecting.
Yeah, so much more interesting to me than any of that is the actual sound design of the film. They actually had two separate teams. They had not just the kind of the Foley guys whose job it is to be like, okay, here's the sound of these guys walking across a room, or here's the sound of the cell door clanking. They had another team whose job is to just find weird stuff and bury it in the mix to create kind of the ambiance. And those guys are Skip Leavesay and Ron Bashar. And there's a
Lynchian.
Yes, there's room tones. In 1995 issue of Siniste, Bashar explained that for Clarice's first visit to Lecter in the hospital, there were animal screams and noises built into the ambiance itself down there. From a movie I had made years ago called Little Monsters, I took this lunatic kind of screaming that I had recorded. I took the track, processed it, slowed it down, and played it in reverse. That became one of the ambiences in the room, too. It's the room tone, but the room tone has been made from some guy screaming in pain. Fitting. Skip Leavesay told the New York Times in 1991 that for Bill's lair, he used the sound of rain falling in an Amazonian forest, and then he slowed it down to the point where just the occasional drop or plink would sound like a... And then he further distorted that electronically. And also in the mix, buried deep within there in Bill's basement scene, is like the sound of an oil rig crane, the barking of seals, the howling of wolves. I haven't listened to this movie I haven't watched it on headphones yet, but I actually want to go back because, another thing that they talk about is supposedly when they do the whole... his heartbeat never got above 85, even when he was eating her tongue. They said they make the sound mix sound like heartbeats, which is really interesting and
wild,
horrifying.
For a movie that didn't have a huge budget, I really admire the extra mile they went with this.
Yeah. Leavesay said in an interview with designingsound.org, Jonathan would have to, battle with the rest of the crew to put our stuff in, but he really liked it, and he convinced them all to be quiet and let him experiment with this stuff. And oftentimes that meant taking out Howard Shore's score and listening to these sounds. And he had to endure this crush of negative vibe, like, you're ruining the film. Why are you putting all that noise in there? The music is so great. And Jonathan, bless his heart, endured all that. Demme told the Directors Guild in an interview, with Silence of the Lambs, we wanted to create this mood of extraordinary dread and suspense. Even before we started shooting, for the scene where Clarice first meets Dr. Lecter, I talked to production mixer Chris Newman about what would lead us to a sense of dread. Are there ways you can mic this? Is there B-roll you can get? How can we make it feel like Clarice is literally going to hell in this meeting? And you wind up with things like, let's make it sound like she's in a submarine. And then let's get humpback whale sounds and mix them in. Writing on Silence of the Lambs in 1992, Roger Ebert pointed out the film's sound design is also focused on breath in a way that you wouldn't ordinarily, even the Foley stuff, like people's breaths are highlighted in a way that because if you think about your normal film, even something that's very dialogue heavy, you don't hear people breathe because it's just considered distracting, right? Unless it's designed to be part of the mix. And it was very much so in this film. And the movie is actually bookended with Clarice's breath. Because if you remember, it opens up with her jogging the training course. And so you get the sound of her exhalations. She's winded. And then again, in the night vision scene, that the whole thing closes with you just hear her after she shoots him, just like breathing heavily. And he is exhaling his last breaths. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of my favorite, creepiest, weirdest Easter eggs. When that moth chrysalis is pulled out of the corpse's throat at the autopsy, the corpse exhales.
This dying breath had been plugged. Oh,
so upsetting and so perfect. And then there's a point at which Clarice exhales, right? She just blows out her breath, and Lecter immediately inhales, like he's trying to breathe her breath in. Just the little touches in this, and it all plays into what I said earlier about how it's gothic. Like every single location in this movie is like a haunted house. Even even the sterility of like the FBI headquarters all have this kind of claustrophobic, dense ambiance to them. It's so great. But despite all the fraught filming scenarios, locations, and dynamics, the atmosphere on the set was pretty lighthearted. As you mentioned earlier, they had Hawaiian shirt Fridays, and on they celebrated Valentine's Day while shooting. Brooke Smith said, "The crew ate lamb and made the blueprint of the set into a board game called the Gum Game. It had stuff like liposuction, go back 2 spaces. And the object was to save Catherine."
There's this great behind-the-scenes picture of one of Lecter's cellmates gleefully holding a sheet cake for his birthday, like
Aww.
in his cell. Yeah, it's great. One person on the cast is quoted as saying, "You don't always get to have so much fun on something so awful."
Yeah. But there was one key change from the book that made it to the film. In the novel, Lecter bids Clarice farewell with a letter. It actually, in the book, if I remember correctly, she is shown to be, I think she's like pictured in bed with the guy she meets at the museum, who's like flirting with her, the one bug guy, and he comes to her graduation. So you do see him again in the film, but I think Thomas Harris makes it explicit that they were like dating by the end of it. But Ted Talley decided that wasn't cinematic enough, so he wrote an ending in which Lecter has the same phone call with Clarice, but then he hangs up and approaches a bound Dr. Chilton. He's holding a knife, and he says something like, "Well, Dr. Chilton, shall we begin?" "Well, Dr. Chilton, shall we begin?" Jonathan, who hadn't asked for a lot of changes, said, "Well, that's kind of icky," Ted Talley told Deadline. "Chilton is despicable, and we don't like him, and he's a crumb bum." I love that. "But he's still a human being, and to have him trussed up for slaughter is just too squirmy. Ted, should we give him some kind of a fighting chance?" Talley continued, "I was a little miffed. I thought I'd been so clever to work out that ending. But I thought about it and I said, well, what if Chilton fled the country instead of hiding out in his house? Only Lecter has figured out where he went and got there first. Never mind how Lecter would figure that out. I have no idea." Jonathan said, "So you're proposing that the last thing we shoot in this movie will make us all have to go to a tropical island at the studio's expense?" Ted Talley said, "Yes, that is exactly what I am suggesting." But Demi told Deadline, "I needed to clear this with Thomas Harris, who I had a minimal relationship with. So before we started filming, I called Tom. He said he wished us luck, but he was not going to see the movie. But we had stayed scrupulously faithful to his great book, and now we wanted to do this radical departure at the end. We were in Miami anyway, and so I went to Tom's house there. We sit down, have a nice tea, and I tell him that I want to change his ending. I want to see Lecter out in the world, and how would he feel about that? He gave us his blessing, but he said a couple things I thought were great. If you take Lecter to the tropics, there's one thing I'm sure of. He would never sweat. So, armed with that, when you see that scene, everybody's sweating like crazy, except for Dr. Lecter. The ending was shot in Bimini, off the coast of Florida, and unfortunately the weather didn't cooperate for the entire week the production was shooting down there. It just rained, and was why it's like all overcast and gray there. Demi initially balked at using a crane shot for that now iconic credit scene. He said it was going to be difficult to get the necessary equipment on location, which, sure, but Ted Talley persisted, and he was correct. It's funny, for the audio, to do the overdubs for this, Anthony Hopkins had already started filming something in Utah. He was already off that side of the country. And so they patched him through to Foster to record this line, but they didn't tell her that it was actually going to be him on the phone. I think they just said, "Okay, Jodie, we're just going to record your lines and then we'll mix it up." And so they were like, "All right, pretend, I guess, to hold the phone." And Anthony Hopkins is actually on the other end doing Lecter. It's horrifying.
Yeah, Hopkins said of that shot where he's walking off into the crowd, just sort of vanishing, which is kind of the most terrifying thing. Is you suddenly not seeing Hannibal Lecter is even scarier than seeing him, because you now don't know where he is.
It's the best. It's such a great ending.
So great.
And it's, everyone always plays the part of like, you try and follow him as long as you can through the crowd. It's just a perfect ending.
Anthony Hopkins said that he was trying to move like a cat chasing its kill as he was moving.
Scans. After editing, a cut was shown to a small crowd of about 75 people. Manager and literary agent Bob Bookman, who you possibly remember from the beginning of this episode 3 days ago when we started taping it, he invited William Goldman, which feels like a threat. If William Goldman is coming to the rough cut of your movie, You're sweating bullets. Obviously, one of the greatest screenwriters of all time. Literally wrote several books about it that are still used today. Demi told Deadline, I got a phone call at my house the next day. Hi, this is William Goldman calling. I was like, oh, hi, God, one of my favorite writers of all time. He said he thought the picture was terrific, but he thought there was one section that was holding it back from its full potential. This came after Dr. Lecter escapes, and there was the scene that took place somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes. Crawford's kicked off the case, Clarice is kicked out of the academy, they go downstairs, and there's this blistering, really terrific scene on the steps. So Goldman said, take all that out. I'm like, what? That's one of the biggest scenes in the movie. Really? What? And he says, that's what my gut's telling me. You guys should really take a look at it. So I was like, well, thank you for this. Goodbye. Demi told editor Craig Mackey about the call, and Mackey was not happy, Demi said, but they went back to the editing room and rewatched the movie on the machine without that scene, and per Demi, it was just an extraordinary difference, an immeasurable improvement. That is William Goldman. Another thing about the film, and another reason I call it gothic, again, because like true in the sense of like gothic horror is not like grotesque, it is grotesque, but it's not like splattery, it's not gory. And that's a lot with this movie. There's really not that much gore that happens on screen.
I like it.
Yeah. And it remains largely implied, which is something that Demi was keen on from the start. You know, he told Empire violence was not that necessary as an element within the film. The terror is represented through characterization. Jodie Foster told Vanity Fair that after rewatching the film a couple years back, she was struck by the fact there's really no blood and gore. There's only really one scene at all that is gory. The movie is so scary because it seeps into people's consciousness through fears. It works on fear more than anything else. So, with the finished film in the can, they were headed towards the finish line, hampered by the fact that Orion had no money. They were skating on thin ice. They were on a runaway trail train with no... What am I saying here, John? Cut all this. They'd had a terrible 1989. They came in last among the larger studios.
Wow.
They produced a biopic of Jerry Lee Lewis called Great Balls of Fire, starring Dennis Quaid.
It's bad.
I assumed. A movie called She-Devil that teamed Meryl Streep with Roseanne Barr. Speed Zone, an action comedy starring SCTV alumni like John Candy, Joe Flaherty, and Eugene Levy.
Oh, that seems like a good...
Yeah. And Milos Forman's adaptation of Les Liaisons Dangereuses, Valmont, which was released against another Dangerous Liaisons adaptation, the one you've heard of.
Yeah.
And also Weird Al's UHF.
Oh, yeah.
So Orion made a lot of bad decisions. They had a couple more flops in 1990 with The Hot Spot, State of Grace, movies I've never heard. They had a huge win with Dances with Wolves, but that was it. And that was basically what was keeping them afloat. And their founder just kept socking more money into the company. And everyone knew Silence was going to be a hit. They were like, we have a masterpiece on our hands. But Orion literally they didn't have the money to release it during the traditional award show season. Like, February is considered a dumping ground. January and early February are a big dumping ground for movies. You want something to be considered for the Oscars, you put it out in fall, approaching winter. And Orion literally couldn't. They were like, we need the cash that this movie will, generate. So they released it on Valentine's Day, 1991, which ordinarily would have doomed it, but they did have the advantage of, and the other thing too is Orion had no money to campaign for it in the trades or anywhere, but it did have the advantage of opening over a long weekend, President's Day weekend, and raked in nearly 14 million, and then it stayed at number 1 for 5 weeks.
Yeah, these days it's all about what you make the opening weekend. But back in the early 90s, you could afford to have a slow burn, basically. And so that was really what this movie was. Is it was more of a word-of-mouth movie than anything else. I love that it was released on Valentine's Day. Silence of the Lambs released on Valentine's Day. Per Jonathan Demme, that was semi-intentional because he thought it was, quote, a good date movie. Something about Clarice and Dr. Lecter said Valentine's Day to me. Which brings me to a deeper point. I kind of touched on this earlier. The sexual chemistry between Lecter and Clarice may be the weirdest in cinema history, but it is off the charts in this movie, right? Am I alone in thinking that? You won't give me the satisfaction. Okay.
I know, it is. It's a different. I just rewatched this. It's They have chemistry. I don't think it's romantic, though. Yes?
There's love there.
Okay.
There's definitely.
Well, it's funny that Hannibal ends up, the book in Hannibal, Thomas Harris writes them as together. Like, by the end of it, they end up as lovers, which is
maybe
really
that's
bizarre.
why it's in my head. I don't know. I guess they were only in 4 scenes together in the movie, which is wild to think about, considering that's all the stuff that
anyone remembers.
Yeah, exactly. Anthony Hopkins has said, I think Hannibal loves her in a way. He admires her courage. There's this young woman who doesn't have the physical strength of a man, and she comes and visits a monster. And I think he's amused by it. She's got courage. She's come to visit me? Wow. I think he responds to it. And Jodie Foster said something similar. She said, there's a love between us. There's a human connection. There's something like seductive about Hannibal Lecter.
He's very charming.
Like rooting for him, even when he's like beating up the cops.
Hell yeah.
That'd be a bad example. But it's like Dexter. It's like the show Dexter.
Sure. Yeah. A strong critical consensus, except from Gene Siskel, who panned it, and word of mouth helped the film become a sleeper hit, grossing a total of $275. Grossing a total of $275 million worldwide. Though the film swept the Guild and Critics Awards, the consensus was that opening nearly a year before the next Oscars was going to scotch its chances. And interestingly, the Golden Globes, which are usually considered the predictor, the sort of smart betting predictor of the Oscars, did not have Silence in them very much at all. Jodie Foster won Best Actress in a drama, but then the other top line awards were split between this movie Bugsy that you mentioned earlier. I don't know what this movie is at all. It's been memory hold for me. JFK, The Prince of Tides, and Thelma and Louise, which are all very predictable. But one thing that Orion did have in its pocket was Ted Talley told Deadline, our film had a videotape, and Orion had just enough money scratched together to send them out to voters, the Academy voters. That was still a new idea, and no movie had opened far enough in advance of the Oscars to be on videotape. And he talks about like this thing where it created this effect where people were like, oh, Silence of the Lambs. I remember seeing that movie last year, but then they got this videotape of it and they were like, oh, I'll watch this again and be reminded that it was genius. He said it saved our lives. Orion had just enough money left to do this. That was the extent of it. They didn't reopen the film in New York or LA. They didn't run extensive ads in the trades. That was it. They sent out a tape. Demi told Deadline, the nominations took everybody by great surprise. We thought these bigger pictures would win the prizes, and the only thing I can remember us ever really talking about was the impulse to put Anthony Hopkins in the Best Supporting category because his screen time was so relatively short. Then on the night of the Oscars, he said, we started winning. I was just completely freaked out. Ultimately, Silence became the third and currently most recent film to win the top 5 major categories. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. And it's still the only horror film to win Best Picture. Fun bar trivia, the other 2 films to have swept the top 5 are 1934's It Happened One Night and 1975's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
A reporter on the night of the Oscars asked Anthony Hopkins what he thought Hannibal Lecter would have done had he not won the Oscar. And without a beat, Anthony Hopkins breaks into the Hannibal Lecter voice. Without missing a beat. It's incredible. Well, if I hadn't received it, you would all be in trouble.
You're just sort of elfin, like a little guy,
A little too high.
like the Great Gazoo. There is all right. We've had enough laughs. There is one asterisk on Silence's legacy, and that is its handling of, let's just say, the portrayal of what is perceived as transgenderism in the movie. The most common defense of the book and the film is that Harris and Demi and all of them went out of their way to highlight the fact that the character of Buffalo Bill is not a trans person. They say it in the book. He's not transgender. He just thinks he is. And that's a verbatim line in the movie. And Demi wanted to keep that in there.
Yeah, Jonathan Demme says, basically paraphrases something that Hannibal Lecter says in the movie. Somebody that hates themselves so much that they will do anything to turn themselves into someone who has no resemblance to themselves. So that is his psychological assessment of Buffalo Bill.
And Ted Levine, for his part, said he never played the character as gay. He said that he and Demi had these conversations about the character, during which Demi basically said, I don't want to, I'm worried about this character coming off this way. And Levine said, the stance I took was one of a more acutely homophobic heterosexual man doing that mocking thing.
And Ted Levine also added that he believed the character, quote, wanted the power that he imagined a woman would possess.
But Coming on the heels of the AIDS epidemic, the trans community was understandably not thrilled to have one of the biggest movies of the year star a killer playing up on public misconceptions of drag and transgenderism. And it was building on a pretty bad climate of LGBTQ portrayal in Hollywood. You had the gay criminal conspirators in JFK, Sharon Stone's murderer in Basic Instinct is bisexual, and then there's Dressed to Kill, which is a De Palma film in which I think it's Michael Caine plays a quote-unquote transgender murderer. And Silence was protested by activist groups across the country at theaters. ACT UP and Queer Nation showed up at the 1992 Oscars for a protest, which resulted in 10 arrests. Mark Dice has a book called Hollywood Propaganda, How TV's Movie and Music Shape Our Cultures. And he quotes a GLAAD leader who criticized Silence of the Lambs, saying, "The killer in this movie is a walking, talking gay stereotype. He has a poodle named Precious. He sews, he wears a nipple ring, he has an affected feminine voice, and he cross-dresses. He completely promotes homophobia." Orion Pictures, who produced and distributed the film, tried their best to calm things down by loaning out prints of the film for AIDS fundraisers, which feels like a miss, guys. And most troublingly, Silence was released into a period of a nationwide spike in anti-gay violence. There was a study issued by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Policy Institute, released in March 1991, reported that incidents of violence against gay men and lesbians in 1990 had risen by an average of 42% in New York, Boston, Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. New York's crimes jumped 65%.
Wow.
And Demme was initially a little more combative towards the criticism. He told the New York Times in 1993, "I got all this unfounded abuse on Silence of the Lambs. Bill wasn't a gay character. He was a tormented man who hated himself and wished he was a woman because that would have made him as far away from himself as he possibly could be." But he did seem to evolve his views on this. He told the Daily Beast in 2014, a few years before he died, "James Gumb isn't gay, and this is my directorial failing in making Silence of the Lambs, that I didn't find ways to emphasize the fact that Gumb wasn't gay." Juan Botas, who is one of the inspirations for Philadelphia, said to me, "You can't imagine what it's like to be a 12-year-old gay kid, and you go to the movies all the time, and whenever you see a gay character, they're either a ridiculous comic relief caricature or a demented killer. It's very hard growing up gay and being exposed to all these stereotypes." That registered with me in a big way.
And there was also an incident where representatives of an LGBTQ organization passed out leaflets at a screening where Silence was taking place. And Jonathan Demme was actually there. And instead of ignore it, he got up to the podium and urged the crowd to read these leaflets. So he was, very open to obviously hearing what these people had to say and really regretted, like you said, his directorial failing for not being more clear about this.
Yeah, one thing that I thought of when I was kind of thinking about how to build this section was, art can't answer for itself, but artists can. And I think that that's the responsibility that people have. So I'm happy that Demme was still talking about this and apologizing for it as recently as a couple years before he died. Jodie Foster is also gay. She was closeted for a very long time, but eventually came out. She told Vanity Fair that in addition to the line about Bill not being trans, they actually shot a scene with a psychiatrist that would have reinforced these themes, but it ended up being cut. And she said in this interview, "I think I can say this now because Jonathan's gone. I feel like he was really heartbroken that he didn't make that clear in the film. If there's ever a gnawing part of him, I think he really did understand where the controversy came from, and he felt like he didn't do as good a job at making his intentions clear. If there was something to revise, I think he would have gone back and revised that just to make it very clear." Demme's next film was, in fact, the AIDS parable Philadelphia, which is one of the first Hollywood productions to even mention AIDS. And while it's been claimed that he was inspired to make that film by the backlash to Silence, that isn't strictly true. His then producer, Edward Saxon, who, funnily enough, provided the mold for the head that they find in the car. That is another Jonathan Demme cameo from that film, is his producer cameos as a severed head. Anyway, that guy said at the time, "We had wanted to make a movie in which AIDS was a major character before we ever filmed Silence of the Lambs." With Philadelphia, Demme was more prepared for the backlash this time around. He said, "I expected it. I actually hoped for it. It's the job of militants to demand more of anything. If these people were satisfied, change would be hard to get through. Every one of them is right. There could have been more of this or more of that, but now maybe another film will take it further." That statement did not mollify the firebrand playwright and ACT UP founder Larry Kramer, who wrote in a LA Times op-ed on Philadelphia, I bring up the painful reminder that Demme also directed The Silence of the Lambs, which many gays consider one of the most virulently and insidiously homophobic films ever made. Is Philadelphia some sort of attempt on his part to offer an apology? After these two films, I wish he'd just go away and leave us alone. Plenty of scholars and activists have written about this side of Silence's legacy, but one of my favorites is the trans critic Emily St. James. She tweeted in 2021, knowing the intent of a work doesn't mean shit, because the intent is less important than the impact. And when people saw Silence of the Lambs, they didn't hear Buffalo Bill isn't trans. They saw a weirdo serial killer dancing around in women's clothes. It is one of the most influential movies ever made. Its influence includes transphobia. Yeah, so I think about that, and I like I said, art can't answer for itself, but artists can. And, looking at things within the lens of their time, or, saying it was just a product of its time, or whatever, I've never really enjoyed that. I think criticism of art strengthens it, and that's just something to consider for this film. Is, as we have said many times before, in all other ways, perfect. No segue. Silence actually came out at the tail end of the peak of what is recognized as peak serial killer in America, which they have actually identified, which is horrifying. That is roughly 1970 to 1990. Ted Bundy had been executed in 1989, and Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in July of 1991. I don't think they found BTK until the mid-90s, but I think he'd stopped killing before then. Anyway, Lecter, of course, cast the film's longest shadow. Hopkins' portrayal ushered in a new era of cinematic stereotypes where killers were erudite and sophisticated instead of frothing lunatics or neurotic lone wolf weirdos. Criminologist and author Scott Bond told Vanity Fair in 2021 that for 10 years, while he was teaching criminology and criminal justice classes, about half his students told him they wanted to be Clarice Starling. So now we have to get into Dino De Laurentiis being a money-grubbing cartoon Italian. This guy's so ridiculous. He owned the rights to Harris's characters, but he, as we mentioned earlier, he let Orion make Silence for free. So even before Silence had come out, Tom Pollock, who's the chairman at Universal who had worked with Dino De Laurentiis, was lobbying him to, if you make any sequel to this movie, because he knew he owned the rights, you have to make it at Universal. And De Laurentiis felt that Tom Pollock was using other films that they were working on as leverage for this. And this whole thing went to court. There was a $25 million lawsuit that ended up happening. But that was all extremely premature because Thomas Harris takes forever to write. Each year, De Laurentiis would fly down to Miami with his personal chef and have dinner with Harris and ask him, how's the follow-up coming? Where's my new Hannibal book?
He's not still alive, is he? No.
De Laurentiis? No. Hannibal picks up 10 years after Silence left off, with Lecter on the loose in Italy and Starling disgraced after a raid gone bad. One of Lecter's earliest victims, a disfigured cattle magnate named Mason Verger, plans to use her to bring Lecter out of hiding, at which point he will kidnap him and feed him alive to specially bred pigs. The novels end in which a drugged-up Clarice... Do you remember how this book ends? It is truly insane. Hannibal has bought...
Brains are eaten, that's what I remember.
Well, yeah, but it's weirder than that. Hannibal dug up Clarice's dad's bones and put her on like a crazy psychotropic cocktail, and that has this whole elaborate Grand Guignol dinner scene where he cooks and eats... He lobotomizes a guy while he's still alive, her FBI rival, or Justice Department? I forget. And it's Ray Liotta in the movie. He takes off the top half of this dude's head, takes out a portion of his brain, cooks it at dinner, and Clarice eats it, and then he shows her the bones of her dad, and then they are in love, and they travel the world together. It's literally how that book ends. It's very bizarre.
It's like that South Park episode with Radiohead.
Yes.
Scott Hanneman would die, where he feeds him his parents.
Yes.
Or Cartman feeds him his parents, yeah.
Your tears are so sweet. Anyway, that was enough for Demme to pass. In the 2010 biography channel History, Inside Story, The Silence of the Lambs, Demme said, Tom Harris, as unpredictable as ever, took Clarice and Dr. Lecter's relationship in a direction that just didn't compute for me. I thought, I can't do this. And then
do you think he was trying to sabotage these people? Because he's already talking about like, yeah, I don't really I mean, I guess financially that would only be hurting himself, but it seems like Thomas Harris isn't really thrilled about his movie adaptation. So he's like, all right, I'm going to make this thing that they can't make into a movie.
My sense is that he wanted to do Hannibal. We'll get to the one that he didn't want to do. De Laurentiis told Premiere Magazine of Demi's decision, "When the Pope dies, we create a new Pope. Good luck to Jonathan Demme. Goodbye." What a bastard. They also don't create a new Pope. You find a new Pope. What do you think? Popes are grown in labs? You Italian weirdo. Ultimately, I'm Italian, by the way, so I can say all this. Ultimately, they went with Ridley Scott, who initially thought that they were pitching him a biopic of the sacking of Carthage. He said, "I don't want to do a film about bloody elephants." And they said, no, it's about Hannibal Lecter, not Hannibal, the elephant guy from antiquity. Ted Talley also declined. David Mamet supposedly did a draft of this, which is wild. Julianne Moore replaced Jodie Foster. Foster had told Larry King in 1997 that she would definitely be a part of a sequel, adding the same year to Entertainment Weekly that Anthony Hopkins also talks about it. Everyone wants to do it. Every time I see Anthony, it's like, when is it going to happen? But years later, Foster told Total Film, "The official reason I didn't do Hannibal is that I was doing another movie, Flora Plum. So I could say in a nice, dignified way that I wasn't available when that movie, Hannibal, was being shot. But Clarice meant so much to Jonathan and I. She really did. And I know it sounds kind of strange to say, but there was no way that either of us could really trample on her." Asked if she saw Hannibal, she said, "I did. I won't comment." De Laurentiis' version of this, he told Premiere, was that Foster asked for $20 million up front and 15% of the gross. And which is kind of, 15% might be a lot, but $20 million up front is pretty standard, you know. Friggin' Julia Roberts was getting 20 mil a pick, and
maybe she was highballing him just so that he would have to be the one to say no.
Yeah, but no, he hung up on her, I believe. Hopkins made $11 million for coming back for Hannibal. He told Premiere, "I never thought a sequel would come up. And then it did, and I thought, okay, fine, let's see what it's like. I tend to be low-key about things like that. I liked the script. I didn't know what the problem was. I said yes. It was as simple and as matter of fact as that. It's a living. It's just work." Then he would later tell Vanity Fair, "I saw the poster for Hannibal somewhere, and I thought, why did I do that? And then I remembered it paid my mother's hospital bills."
Oh.
Yeah. Thomas Harris once again gave the director permission to change the ending, which instead saw Hannibal chop off his own hand to escape Starling. Hannibal it's fine. Reviews are mixed, but it made enough money to get Universal and Gear to remake Red Dragon, starring Edward Norton alongside Hopkins returning for a third time, and Ralph Fiennes, and directed by now disgraced garbage human and enemy of the pod, Brett Ratner. That movie is not good. In 2016, Hopkins said of the sequels, "I made the mistake of doing 2 more Hannibal Lecter movies, and I should have only done 1. But Dino De Laurentiis wasn't done squeezing every last bit of cash out of Lecter with his olive oil-stained hands. No. He essentially strong-armed Thomas Harris into writing, at a greatly accelerated pace, a prequel book, Hannibal Rising, that would then be adapted into a movie. Harris has not commented on this, but a February 2007 issue of Entertainment Weekly features a pretty damning quote from De Laurentiis. "I say to Thomas," and this is his actual quote, I'm not doing an offensive accent. "I say to Thomas, if you don't do the prequel, I will do it with someone else. I don't want to lose this franchise, and the audience wants it." He said, "No, I'm sorry." And I said, "I will do it with someone else." And then he said, "Let me think about it. I will come up with an idea." So that dude. I hate that. I hate that, man. That's what they did to Lana Wachowski for Matrix Reloaded, where Warner Brothers was like, "We're going to do this with or without you. You can either come on board or we're going to just do someone else." Hollywood, magical industry. Hannibal Rising was savaged critically, and it made a respectable 82 mil on a reported 50 mil budget, but it basically killed the franchise until 2012, when Brian Fuller's NBC series, Hannibal, starring Mads Mikkelsen in the titular role, picked up. I actually like Hannibal quite a lot. It's very visually beautiful and very twisted, but very well acted. And the 3-season arc of that show combines the plots of Red Dragon and Hannibal, but it fudges the timeline so that the whole thing builds up to him meeting Clarice. And then in 2021, CBS made a series called Clarice, because...
What?
Yeah, you didn't hear about this?
No.
No IP remains unturned in the current Hollywood climate, that focused on the events between Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal. The most recent news reports I read about it suggest that it is unlikely for it to get a second season. But ultimately, despite all of those misbegotten sequels, Silence remains relatively untarnished. In 2018, Empire ranked it 48th on their list of the 500 greatest movies of all time. The American Film Institute ranked it their 5th greatest and most influential thriller. Starling and Lecter ranked among the greatest film heroines and villains. And always my personal favorite, the Library of Congress selected the film for preservation in the National Film Registry in 2001, deeming it culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. And then finally, 2 years after the film swept the Oscars, Thomas Harris turned on the TV to check the weather and landed on a cable channel. And he said, the dialogue was very familiar. So I sat down and watched it. It was a wonderful movie.
Wow, coming from him.
So there's your happy ending.
That's the opposite of Ken Kesey flicking through the channels and seeing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the Milos Forman version on TV, and absolutely hating it and changing the channel right away.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. There's a great line from Anthony Hopkins about why this movie, and so many psychological thrillers, but especially this movie, continue to resonate with so many people. You've just given yourself a little rehearsal for what terror is really like, but you know that you're really safe. I just thought that was a really elegant, articulate way to sum up a very complex psychological concept.
Yeah, he talks about going in the theater, and he's like, and you're in the dark, and and then you come out when you're in all the people in the daylight, and it's this wonderful contrast. Talking with Vanity Fair, Foster and Hopkins bantered a little bit about the lines that they get badgered with the most. Hopkins said, I never get tired of it. I mean, it's worn a bit thin now when people say, do the slurping sound. I say, okay, fava beans and all that, but I'm amused by it. And Jodie Foster added, I do love it when people say, can I get you a nice Chianti? I still love it. And there's no part of me that'll ever be tired of it. Mostly because it's such a damn good movie. Almost 3 hours later, here we are. 25 pages? 25 pages on Silence of the Lambs. Folks, thank you so much for listening. And in case it was not evident, this is one of my favorite movies of all time. Real passion project for me. So thank you for going on this journey with us.
It's time to have an old friend for dinner. Don't bother tracing the call. I won't be on.
Don't bother tracing the call. I won't be on long enough for a trace. Oh, that joke's worn thin. Folks, thank you for listening. This has been Too Much Information. I'm Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh. We'll catch you next time. Too Much Information was a production of iHeart Radio.
The show's executive producers are Noel Brown and Jordan Runtagh.
The show's supervising producer is Michael Alder June.
The show was researched, written, and hosted by Jordan Runtagh and Alex Heigl.
With original music by Seth Applebaum and the Ghost Funk Orchestra. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more podcasts on iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.